We're like rule followers.
No.
Those days are over. Hey. Yeah, so we have.
3.5 hours each.
Maybe he just transferred it over.
I think so. You can hold it.
This is a 30,000.
Oh,
It's a takeaway.
right out. Right out here, you can check it out.
have that one yet?
Uh-huh.
Down the hall.
And then
Can we put back up on the monitor?
That one, I think the one that was sent out before,
tourism,
revised, so that's,
yeah,
just
and
picked
then
up.
we're gonna talk about.
You know, that's okay, so that's at the start.
And I already.
Yeah,
And so, he's like.
You know what, it might be best if they just, because that other one had some, it was a draft.
So, he was like, that's fine, I'll do that. I'm like, okay.
That's okay. That's okay, but if you want to hand that out, then that's a correct question.
Right?
Right off. Or somebody scare one out. So get it off.
All right, let me review what I say.
No, but we really should.
We're gonna,
We'd like to.
Yes, yes, sir.
yeah, that's, yeah. They see
Well, yes, we need to put our name, that's what we need to put our names down.
Oh, do you want me to ask Michelle?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Hi, Mike. Good, how are you? Good. Okay, thank you. I'll just open it up.
Just over there. Informal.
Yeah.
Oh.
I was reading an article on, was it, about things you should, costumes you should avoid. One that said to avoid sexy costumes.
Normally,
Which I thought,
upstairs.
actually, I would.
Hey, Mike.
I've seen those
How are you?
before.
Yeah, contingent.
I know you miss
Face
that.
me, too.
I know you miss that.
South Camp. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Friday, October 29th, 2021. We are calling a special meeting to order. It is 2:07. I'd like to ask for a moment of silence, silent reflection, or silent prayer. Thank you. Now I'm going to ask one of our local businessmen, since we're having an economic discussion today, I'd like to ask one of our local businessmen, Mr. Kevin Doherty, to come forward and please lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
On the spot. Hello, everybody. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. For the record, this is the special board meeting of October 29th, 2021, called pursuant to Government Code Section 54956. Madam Clerk, roll call, please.
Supervisor Miller? Here. Supervisor Wynn?
Here.
Supervisor Boudoir?
Present.
Supervisor Rickman?
Here.
And Chairman Patty?
Yes, thank you. I'm here. We're going to jump right into this. We have a special presentation of the 2021 San Joaquin Economic Recovery and ARPA Disbursement Study conducted by Beacon Economics. I'd like to ask our CAO, Mr. Jay Wilberding, please start us off.
Thank you, Chair Patty, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the presentation of the San Joaquin County American Rescue Plan Act Strategy by Beacon Economics. Just a little background information about why we're all here is back in April of this year, the board was looking to my office for information regarding the pandemic's economic impact on our county. And having looked around for what kind of reporting information was available, I wanted to do something that was a little more custom tailored. What I was finding available was kind of generic, it was more off the shelf, and I wanted something that was more specific to what we might be able to do with our ARPA money and make it a lot more actionable. And so I reached out to Beacon Economics, and who are they? And these two gentlemen will tell you more in a second. Beacon Economics is an independent research and consulting firm which provides objective-based economic analysis. Their practice covers sustainable growth and development, economic forecasting, industry analysis, economic policy analysis, and economic impact studies. And as you can see on the agenda, our meeting today is broken down and organized into two parts. Dr. Chris Thornburg, sitting beside me here, will be presenting an overall macro discussion of the pandemic, its economic impact, and an overview for 2020-21. Chris founded Beacon Economics in 2006. I've known him for probably 5 or 6 years. I've heard him speak multiple times when I was auditor and controller at the Auditor and Controller Conference. And he and I have had numerous discussions about economic issues over the years, and I think you'll enjoy hearing him speak. Patrick Adler, sitting next to Chris, will be presenting the detailed analysis of the work they actually performed for us regarding this project, which includes a tactical analysis that's tailored for San Joaquin County, as I mentioned a moment ago. And as a side note, Patrick recently received his PhD from UCLA this past June with a specialization in regional development. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Chris to take it away.
Thank you very much. Go ahead and go over here. Yes, it did make it over here. All right, excellent. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. As noted, I'm the founding partner of Beacon Economics. I should probably also point out that I'm the director of the UC Riverside Center for Economic Forecasting and Development. I've been sort of very lucky to be able to do work all over the state, and I have a lot to talk about in terms of both what's happening right now, what's happening locally, what's happening in the broader world, where things may be heading, but also some long-run visions for the Central Valley. And I hope that you appreciate, if you will, that maybe some of the stuff you're going to hear today is a little different than what you normally hear, both about the pandemic as well as about the Central Valley. But obviously, at some level, I'm just, what would you call it? I'm just kind of humorous content. Obviously, Patrick's the center, should be the center of attention here, talking about the specific plan. But it's good to know a little bit about why we chose the plan we did, and some thoughts about what's coming up in the future. To start this conversation, I'm going to bring you back to about 18 months ago. Of course, at the beginning of 2020, there were, even at the end of 2019, we were hearing something about something called COVID. No one really had much idea what it all meant. By March, it turned out this was a global situation. It was here inside the United States. It had been here for a while. And there were a lot of conversations about what it meant, if you will, from just the pure humanity situation. But of course, you were also privy to this pandemic panic, I would call. This is some of the headlines you saw a year and a half ago. Scar the labor market for the next decade. Worst downturn since the Great Depression. Home prices are going to fall. 15 million households are going to stop paying their mortgage. 30 to 40 million people are going to be evicted, and so on and so on and so on. Now, at some level, I will tell you that it's not much of a surprise that we went to these, I would call hysterical sort of predictions, because in a lot of ways, the last decade in the United States has pretty much been hysterical prediction after hysterical prediction after hysterical prediction. It's been the age of miserableism, I like to call it, where every time you pick up the paper, people have to tell us how terrible everything is. even while walking down the street, opening your eyes, you realize things look pretty good and seem to be getting better. Now, we never really bought into this. And I'll come back to why we didn't buy into this. And it's nothing to diminish, if you will, the tragedy of the pandemic itself, but the economic consequences of pandemics are not long. Natural disasters are not long. And that's really what we started with. There's no doubt we have to grieve for the millions of people who died, the millions of families who lost loved ones. But again, a history of natural disasters is pretty clear. These situations do not have long-run economic consequences. So as a result of that, we were like, well, this is going to go away pretty quick. It's not a typical kind of recession driver. But of course, that was not the narrative we heard. I showed you the panic points. And it did panic our government. And as a result of that, you put in the shall we say, hyper-partisan political times. And the next thing you know, we saw our policymakers open the spigot like we've never seen before. $9 trillion in stimulus, $5 trillion in fiscal stimulus, $4 trillion in quantitative easing. They have thrown so much money at this economy. And that money's out there. If you look at where the economy is, I know we just got this 2% growth in the third quarter, completely irrelevant, because if you want to know where the economy's heading, you only have to look at demand. And there is so much pent up in this demand right now. But the problem here, from a medium-term perspective, is that public policy, these stimulative efforts, these are not free things. They cost, right? There's a cost to borrowing trillions of dollars. There's a cost to pumping trillions of dollars into the money supply, whether it's the fiscal debt problems, whether it's the potential for inflation. In other words, right now the U.S. economy is taking off like a rocket, but the question is what's going to happen when that rocket fuel runs out? As for the supply chain problems, you've heard about the ports, you can't buy a car, the retail shelves are empty. What's going on? Well, it's interesting because the recovery we're seeing in the U.S. is not even. They've stimulated the economy. Some parts of the economy, particularly the service sector, is still trying to recover. The other parts of the economy have been heated white hot. And as a result of that, we're just not in a position to be keeping up with demand right now. This is why the ports are so crowded and the warehouses are so crowded and we can't get stuff. But these are temporary problems. These supply chain problems will eventually fade away, and we will eventually catch up with demand. As for these day-to-day crises, look, there is obviously a tendency in the press to try and find trouble, right? And you always can. We know there are households among us who need help. They always do. The problem is there are assigning all the problems we see in our world today to the economic ramifications of the pandemic, which is simply nonsensical. Look, here's probably one of the most important aggregate statistics I can tell you about the U.S. economy. The poverty rate in 2020 fell relative to 2019. So for all the chaos of the pandemic, poverty rates in the United States went down. Now, it isn't to say, obviously, that there aren't people out there who need help. That's a completely different conversation. But clearly, the pandemic is not a source of any kind of significant economic problems in the United States right now. Where is the economy heading from here? Well, here's something I learned in the last 18 months. Every time I picked up a newspaper article and there was the words new normal in it, I stopped reading. Because if anybody thinks epidemics are a new normal, you apparently don't seem to realize that the Egyptians were writing about epidemics in 2000 BC. There's nothing new about epidemics. And the history shows us that human beings persevere, we mitigate, we move on, we live, we survive. It's as simple as that. But there is no doubt that the pandemic is accelerating underlying trends that were already in the economy. And these are trends we have to pay attention to. And those are things like, for example, de-retailing and, very importantly, for both Stockton, California, and the nation overall, a massive labor shortage that was already brewing long before the pandemic actually hit the U.S. economy. As for real estate, we know it's hot, 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 but it's not a bubble. Indeed, I am worried about the U.S. economy, the direction we're heading right now, but it's not the private sector. In 2005, when I was worried about real estate bubbles and talking about that, I was panicked about what's happening in the private sector. Today, the private sector still looks pretty good, but the public sector is where the worries lie, because what does this massive injection of stimulus into our economy mean? And what does it mean for the economy when that stimulus is finally has to be taken away? We just don't know. But at least what we're seeing in the private sector today is perfectly sustainable. Now, there's a lot to cover, and again, Patrick's really the center of attention here, so let me just jump really quick get through some of these slides, and then we'll turn it over to him. Why? Why was this not the depression they told us it was going to be? Well, you know, when we entered into the Great Recession all those years ago, it was an economy that was not healthy. It felt healthy in 2006. We all felt rich. The economy was growing at 3%. Unemployment was nice and low. But when you looked at the economy, it was being heated white hot by subprime lending. And when you looked at what subprime lending was doing to the U.S. economy, if you were willing to look at the structure of growth, you realized it was rotten to the core and it was only a function of time until everything fell apart. This time around, it's not that situation at all. We actually came into the pandemic with an economy. I know a lot of people kept talking about the recession was going to happen and how things were so bad, whether it was Chinese trade wars or the real estate collapse. That was, again, just miserablest nonsense. The economy, fundamentally, was in pretty good shape. Financial obligations ratio, the share of household income spent on debt and credit cards, was the lowest it had ever been. You had a situation where savings rates were at a 30-year high. Between 2016 and 2019, I know you didn't hear about it in the paper, but the official statistics came out, and both income inequality and wealth inequality declined between 2016 and 2019. It's hard to believe, but the economy was in pretty good shape. The recession driver. Back then, the bubble broke. Suddenly, my house isn't worth what I thought. My stock portfolio isn't worth what I thought. My business isn't making any money. We went through a real problem because people had picked up a lot of debt. The fake wealth disappeared, and suddenly we all had to rebuild our portfolios. That's a painful process that hurts every part of the economy. Yes, housing got hammered. Consumer finance got hammered. But in the end, the big problem was Americans had to save a lot more to rebuild their balance sheet to get ready for whatever's next. And that takes years. This time around, it wasn't that at all. It was a completely different kind of situation. It was a supply shock. And the difference between those two things boils down to this. In 2010, people didn't go to restaurants because they couldn't afford to. In 2020, they didn't go to restaurants because they weren't allowed to. Why is that different? Well, if you can't afford to, you're not spending that money on anything. If you're not allowed to, you're going to spend money on something else. Did anybody try to buy a bicycle last Christmas? A hot tub? Is anybody trying to buy a car right now? Again, there's nothing out there because all that money that wasn't spent on hotels and Disneyland and trips to Paris was spent on bicycles and all the other stuff. Some parts of the economy were hurt, other parts of the economy were doing fine. The government response back then was inadequate, this time it was excessive. The net result last time, the Great Recession, the worst downturn in the post-World War II period, was 9 years from beginning to end. This one's about 1 year, a little over 1 year, and by the way, the economy is now in the process of clearly overheating. There's no doubt about it. Now, what do I mean by overheating? Here's some of the data. We know we got that 2% growth, and not a big surprise. There's a lot of consternation out there. What does this slow growth mean? Well, first of all, it's not a slowing of the recovery because the recovery's done. Take a look at the right-hand side. This is trends in real GDP and real final demand, and I'm showing you kind of where we are. Now, GDP hasn't caught up completely, but spending has. And if you look at final demand, which is spending by government, consumers, and businesses, it's back to where it was pre-pandemic. We're right back on trend. So we are back from a consumption standpoint. Now, the kind of consumption is really heavily based on goods. You can see on the left-hand side. You can see that services are still trying to catch up. This is real spending relative to trend, where at one point in time, goods was way over. Again, I can't go to my favorite restaurant, so I'm going to buy a car. That's the kind of trade-offs that are going on here. And as a result of that, there's tons of goods being sold, and the system just isn't able to keep up with it. Take a look at retail to sales ratios. They've never been lower. They can't keep stuff on the shelves because demand for goods is so heavy at this point in time. The ports are busy across the board. Industrial production is back up. Now, mind you, it would be past where it was, except for the fact that they just can't get inputs to actually do what they need to do. The container costs $10,000. 2 years ago, a container cost about $1,700 for a 40-foot container. Today, it's $10,000 because, again, there's no capacity out there. And of course, I would assume that the ports are backed up. They would just automatically go to double shifts. Apparently, they weren't. For months and months, they sat there with ports lining up, container ships lining up at the port. I didn't realize that it takes an order of the president to get the longshoremen to put in a couple extra hours per day. But it does. He did. The governor's getting involved. In theory, we'll start to catch up, but if you just look at that inventory to sales ratio, it's clear the production part, the manufacturing part of the U.S. economy has got a lot of making up to do, even if demand went back to normal tomorrow, which it isn't. By the way, the uneven structure of, if you will, the kind of demand, we can also see that uneven structure in terms of regionally. Take a look at the left-hand side here. This is an index of taxable sales for the kind of the region up here of California, Alameda County, Sacramento County, San Joaquin County, San Francisco County. Well, San Joaquin, your taxable sales are up from 2016 about 60%. Now, mind you, that trend was already in place and is rapidly accelerated. Money is flowing in here. Then take a look at San Francisco, which is down 30% from where it was back in 2016. Absolutely hammered. But again, think about what's happening. Global tourism, not happening right now. People are not flying into San Francisco for fancy meals or fancy VC conferences. San Francisco is very quiet. People are staying home, they're buying tons of stuff out of the warehouses. And where are the warehouses? In Tracy for the most part. And of course, the money's flowing in here like nobody's business. But it isn't just, of course, taxable sales. Look at jobs. If your eyes are not deceiving you from a MSA or county perspective, Stockton, Lodi, MSA, top of the list, you're less than 1% down from where you were pre-pandemic. Reading, Modesto, Inland Empire are all looking good. Again, it's Napa, San Francisco, Los Angeles, those places with flying tourism that have gotten absolutely hammered. So it's not this standard kind of, oh, you know, center parts of the state get hammered and coastal starts are doing great. It's actually the other way around. Not unlike, by the way, it was in the tech downturn that I think occurred at the beginning of the century. Business investments up, corporate profits for the last year have been at record high levels. I heard the other day the stock market dumped 1%, and some reporter was online and said, oh, the stock market went down because they're so afraid of COVID, the Delta wave. And I'm like, so over the last year, corporate profits have been the highest they've ever been. Through, of course, the fourth quarter of last year when we had the worst surge of this virus to date, when we didn't have a vaccine yet, and we had the worst trials again. Well, why would the stock market be afraid of COVID at this point in time? But again, don't use logic when it comes to these kind of headlines. It just doesn't work that way. The housing market really surprised, right? We were all told housing was going to collapse just like it did back in 2008 and 9. And instead, by the end of last year, the market has absolutely taken off. New home sales, existing home sales, home prices are up almost 20% year over year. Wow. Why? What happened? Well, it's really twofold, right? First of all, in 2019, there were a lot of rumors about how bad our housing market was. And it was already going into some sort of decline. It wasn't. The housing market was fundamentally very, very good. But it had cooled off. Why? Well, interest rates had come up a bit, right? They've gotten close to 5%, and then we had that change in taxes and the ability to write off your interest on your federal taxes, and that cooled the market off. But again, remember, in this world, everybody takes any kind of cooling, calls it a disaster, and everybody goes, hey, I might as well just wait, right? There's no point in buying a house now. I'll wait 3 months and wait for the price to come down 10%. Never going to happen. But people thought that. Now, you come into the pandemic, and of course, a couple things happen. First of all, suddenly, interest rates way down. And everybody started building up money because I couldn't spend money on anything. So I had a huge amount of savings. And the government gave me more. And I remembered I was stuck at home with my kids. Lo and behold, I want a bigger house. Now, when they went out to buy homes, it was actually a very, very tight market. There wasn't a lot of inventory of homes because we haven't built much over the last decade. And when there's not a lot, people are trying to buy. You probably heard the stories of, you know, homes in some little suburb, one home goes up for sale and there's 50 offers. That's the real deal. The market's absolutely taken off. Simple as that. Now, you look locally, same sort of thing. I'm talking about Stockton. In the end of 2019, early 2020, a median price here of a home was about $400,000. It is now $500,000. So it is up a full 20% year over year. Unbelievable prices. By the way, San Joaquin County and Sacramento County, same prices. Wow. Tells you something about demand for homes at this particular point in time. So, again, up as the case may be. Now, is it a bubble? No, it's not a bubble. Look, rapidly rising prices is a symptom of a bubble, but it's not a bubble. Lots of things can make prices go up, right? If you want to talk about bubbles, it has to be I'm overborrowing, I'm overbuilding, and buying a house that's not worth it, I can't afford it. Something else has to be, some fundamental has to be broken. The fundamentals are not broken. If you look at the left-hand side, this is shared mortgage originations above 720. Back in 2002, 3, 4, that was the beginning of the subprime wave, where some Wall Street columnist got his cat a subprime mortgage. I'm not kidding you, right? That was the world we were in. Last decade, incredibly clean mortgage markets. People aren't borrowing them out, very clean credit. But it's not just that. Even costs. Take a look at the right-hand side. Focus on the top for a second. This is owner costs, owner share costs, I'm sorry, this is the share of households who are spending over a third of their income on supporting that house, right? So, burden households. You remember coming up to the 2020 elections, a lot of conversation, Bernie Sanders was all talking about the housing crisis. Americans can't afford housing. But take a look at the numbers. In 2011, 28% of Americans were housing cost constrained. By 2019, that wasn't up, it was down to 19%. Housing was more affordable. Look at California. In 2011, 38% of homeowners here were housing cost constrained. By 2019, that had dropped to 28%. Housing is more affordable now than it was a decade ago. Not less, at least relative to the incomes of people buying it. And you say, how can that be, given how much prices have come up in California? Well, the answer is, it's affordable for those who can buy it. Now, you say, well, what about everybody else? Well, everybody else isn't being included because we don't build enough. We have a supply crisis, not an affordability crisis. The prices reflect the income of that marginal buyer, the last one to win the bidding war. And you're right, everybody else is frozen up because they can't bid that and they have to go to other states. But it is a supply crisis, not an affordability crisis in any sense. And by the way, take a look at the bottom. This is housing costs, again, over 35% of income. These are housing cost constrained. Now here I have owned and rented for the 3 counties here. And again, San Joaquin, 39% down to 26%. You have far fewer housing cost constrained people today than you did a decade ago. Sacramento, same thing. Fresno, same thing. Even for renters. Now, again, a lot of renters still housing cost constrained. It is a problem, but at least the trends are moving in the right direction, which is not what you typically hear. Everybody in California is drowning, they can't afford their home. Not really. That's not the story that's actually out there. In fact, if you look at apartments in the region, apartment rents in Stockton are continue to rise up to 1,300. But of course they would. Look at the vacancy rate. Stockton 3%, Fresno 2%, Modesto 1% vacancy rate. This is a place that desperately needs more apartments, not rent control. It's a different kind of conversation. It's a supply conversation, as simple as that. Now we keep hearing about the 1.4 million Americans are going to be evicted. It was 30 to 40, now they're down to 1.4. Again, nothing has happened. Gavin Newsom, the federal government, both put big funds together to pay people's back rent, and no one's taking it, and they can't figure out why. I have an answer. Maybe it isn't that big of a problem. You see, when you actually look at the data, you look at the buildup in savings, you look at the money that was given out. I'll give you a basic example. According to the Dallas Fed, they did a survey. For people in the bottom 50% of earnings, their checking account balances have gone up by 145% in the last year and a half. They've gone up. If you look at low-income families in California, their level of spending is substantially higher now than it was a year and a half ago. Now again, none of this is to say that these folks, we should get rid of welfare and not help these people. Of course we need to continue to help folks who need help. But the point here is when you think about things in the aggregate, what the trends have been, there's no reason to think that there's going to be a surge in evictions. It just doesn't make any sense. But the narrative is there and people continue to talk about it because the narrative's become pretty unglued from what the data actually tells us about this world. Non-residential permits, obviously a lot of uncertainty. Big decline in permits in 2020, starting to come back in 2021. You look at the data, again, warehouse is the golden child. It's doing great. Warehouse space out here is doing fantastic. Retail vacancy rates are up, there's no doubt about it. There's obviously an issue with retail, but it's not as bad as a lot of folks have figured. Now, going back to the kind of the idea of what's happening out there in the commercial world, take a look at that side. This is national real investment structures, and you can see how retail is going down and industrial is going up. This is Jeff Bezos and Amazon, right? Everybody's buying stuff online. And that means warehouses are more and more important. Take a look at the right-hand side. This is millions of feet of occupied warehouse space, and the East Bay is a lot bigger than Stockton, to say the least, but those are equal scales on each side, about 10 million feet. And in the last, since 2017, in 4 years, you've seen about 8 million square feet of occupied industrial space here in Stockton, here in San Joaquin County. Numbers are through the roof, and they're filling up. They're busy, really busy. East Bay, overall, a couple million, that's it. So again, this is where it's happening. That's a great trend because it brings lots of money in the community, it's bringing jobs into the community. It's a good place to be. Now, retail is still struggling. Stuff is getting bought online. It's retail that's going to survive, it's going to be destination retail. In the short run, retail hasn't gotten completely crushed because they too are benefiting at some from this big surge in consumer spending. But the problems are still out there. The commodity retail is going to be being bought online. Retail of the future has to be destination retail. In other words, you've got to have nice restaurants, you got to have a good movie theater, you've got to have a nice place to hang out, and then you can throw in some other stuff. That's what's going to work into the future. Now, with all this good news, the obvious question is, if things are so good, where are the jobs? We hear that over and over. That's the big thing. 6 million fewer jobs nationally today than we had before the pandemic. How can things be good when we have 6 million fewer jobs? Now, I understand there are 6 million fewer jobs, but the knee-jerk jump to the conclusion is, oh, that's because there's weak labor demand. Now, I understand that at some level. Like, there are fewer jobs in 2011 than there were in 2007 in the U.S. because there was weaker labor demand, no doubt about it. The economy was still struggling to catch up. But that isn't the only reason. In fact, you could have fewer jobs today relative to a couple of years ago if there is a problem with labor supply. And it's worth noting we have 6 million fewer jobs. We also have a national unemployment rate at about 5%, which is pretty low from a long-run perspective. It certainly is unlike, shall we say, the unemployment rate of 9% or 10% that we had for a number of years after the end of the Great Recession. And if you get a little closer, here's probably the best statistic I can tell you. If you think we have a problem with labor demand, then why do we have 11 million job openings in the United States right now? 11 million, that's half again as many as we had 2 years ago. 50% more job openings today. Quits rates in the United States are at the all-time high level. People don't quit if they don't think they can get another job, a better job very quickly. They do because they can. The problem with labor markets is very clear. Over the last couple of years, 3 million people retired. 2.5 million people. The other 500,000 people have left the labor force for other reasons. But 2.5 million people have officially declared themselves to have retired. Now, this goes back to the idea that the pandemic has not created any new normals, but it has accelerated underlying trends. Take a look at the left-hand side here. This is growth in working-age population coming into 2020. And this is, of course, the basic issue that's been with us for a while. The boomers are starting to retire. The boomers are the biggest wave of population. They were all raised in families of 10 kids. They all went out, were so traumatized by that experience, they all went out and one kid. The millennials, right? We see how that turned out, right? Yeah. But to be clear, look, we were losing people in their prime working years. It was shrinking. Now, you didn't feel it. We had a 3.5% unemployment rate. That was a sign of it. But people hadn't actually retired. We had this weird situation because people were going to retire, but the boss was like, don't do it. Please don't do it. I had a buddy of mine who wanted to retire. His boss said, no. So I didn't know you could refuse retirement, but, he kept working. We get into the pandemic. We don't know what's going to happen. A lot of people say, go home. And a lot of people went home and they said, you know what? I like being home. I'm going to retire now. And they did. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that's fine, but it's not the busboys and the cooks who are retiring. No, that's true, but you have all these people retire up here, these people go here, these people go here, these people go here, these people go here, and next thing you know, there's nobody available. 2.5 million people. Now, we've heard a lot about unemployment. There has been this story out there that these generous unemployment benefits are just keeping people sitting on their couch. And if we cut them off, they'll go back to work. Look, I am absolutely sure there are a few people out there who are doing just that. But for the most part, that is not what's happening. For the most part, look, people have opportunities right now. There are jobs available. And if you're going to go out and get a job, you have choices. You're going to find a job that has benefits. It's going to pay you well, has a career ladder, maybe has some training, will be flexible so you can deal with your kids. And you're going to find that job. In other words, there's a big difference between I don't want to work versus I don't want to work here. And most employers are dealing with the I don't want to work here problem. And they're going to have to up their game. It's as simple as that. And this isn't going away anytime in the near future. And you can see it in the data. Again, we've heard all sorts of things about the K-shaped recovery. A K-shaped recovery, by the way, is every recession. That's only a fancy way of saying that low-skilled people don't do as well as high-skilled people. They're recessions. Of course, every recession, the recovery looks like that, with one exception, this one. Because this was a completely different kind of shock to the system. We never had a wage effect. This is data from the Atlanta Fed Wage Tracker. It's based on the current population survey. You look at the data, there was never a slowdown in earnings growth. You either lost your job or you made just as much money and were earning just as much more as you had been. Because yes, if you worked in a restaurant, you didn't have a job. If you're working at Home Depot, you were getting more hours than ever because they were busy. Right now, the greatest pace of earnings increase is at the lowest quartile of earnings. Part-time people are seeing the same earnings growth as full-time people. Now, mind you, if you're worried about income inequality, I have your solution. Labor shortages are a hell of a lift for low-skilled, low-income folks. They're going to do great. On the other hand, if you're trying to run a business, a little rough out there right now. It's very tough. And again, it's not going to go away. Cutting off unemployment benefits is not going to change this dynamic. We have an issue. We need people. As simple as that. Now, when you take a look at kind of regionally what's going on out there, you can see the payroll index. In general, the center parts of the state have been doing better than the coast. And of course, if you want to know what place has done the best, Stockton. You guys, top of the list, right, in terms of growth. A lot of that has to do with the boom in warehouses. Unemployment rate is down to about 8% right now. It was 6% before then. By the way, if I want to say something, well, I'll come back to that in just a second. Because I got to talk about the unemployment thing, but I want to get through some of this stuff first. First of all, let's just take a look at the numbers. I'm just comparing 19 to 21 here to give you some sense of what's going on. And again, your restaurants are trying to hire, they can't hire anybody. Why? Because they all took a job in logistics. I mean, look at the breakdown of numbers, right? You're, from relative to 2 years ago, 4,300 short in government, 3,200 in leisure and hospitality, 1,000 wholesale, 1,000 in other, 8,600 more jobs in logistics. So folks are moving to different jobs. You know, I'm not cooking in that restaurant anymore, but I got a great job in an Amazon warehouse. And by the way, it's good for that worker. But of course, now that the restaurant has demand, is trying to reopen, they're having a terrible time finding somebody to come work for them. So there's been a redistribution of jobs, if you will, and that's been a big problem. Now, where does this, of course, come down from more of a long-run standpoint? And you all have heard about the Regions Rise Together program that came out a couple years ago. It was Gavin Newsom's little pride and joy. I mentioned to you I worked in the Inland Empire, and they wrote an op-ed in the Press Enterprise of the Inland Empire, and these are some choice quotes. Nearly 70% of job growth, 2018 kind of close areas went LA, San Diego. The 4 years, Merced, Kern, see their per capita income dropped to 90% to 65. Higher structural unemployment, fewer jobs in important sectors, right? If you listen to the folks at Gavin Newsom and company, Center Valley is a disaster zone, and they have to come and save the day, as the case may be. Now, as a guy who focuses on the Inland Empire, but does work in Bakersfield, I've done work in Fresno, a couple of years ago I was in Stanislaus County, I'm here with you now. Can I tell you what a pile of crud this is? It's just stunning to me, right? Here's one of my most unfavored people, Joel Cocken, right? In 2018, we became the 5th largest economy in the world by ourselves. And what does he say? Sounds like great news, but according to Joel, almost all those high-income jobs and high-end job growth took place in Silicon Valley. Wasn't for San Jose, the rest of the state would be an economic wasteland. Now, I could be doubly offended by that because I live in Los Angeles. Apparently, even my home is an economic wasteland, right? But it's so nonsensical. Right off the bat, we saw growth in full-time jobs everywhere. Indeed, in terms of just growth in full-time jobs from 14 to 17, the balance of the state outside of the Bay and the southern coast had just as much growth in full-time jobs as the Bay Area did. Now, admittedly, not as many of them were in the 100K plus club, but then again, the Bay Area is shedding jobs under 50K because those jobs can't exist in a place like the Bay Area. It's too expensive. But overall, the growth rate's the same. And by the way, of the 550,000 100K plus jobs, 200,000 of those were in the Bay, 200,000 in coastal Southern California, and the other 150,000 were everywhere else in the state, including here in the Central Valley. So no, it's not the Bay Area doing great and the rest of the state doing nonsensical. Here's another question for you. Here's a little quiz, okay? Now let's go 25 years. Let's talk 1994 to 2019. 5 regions of the state. Coastal Southern California, that's the 3 counties. Central Coast, Bay Area, Inland Northern California, and Inland Southern California. If you're wondering the dividing line, put a line up north of Kern, down and up. On the right-hand side is job growth, payroll job growth over that same period of time. What I want you to do is match the letter and the number. Now, Tom, you want to take a quick stab at where you think Bay Area is?
Well, I'm going to stretch and say Bay Area 81%.
Okay, I'll just give you the answer key. They're lined up perfectly.
Really?
Yes. So the inland Southern California has added 81%. Inland Northern California, including Stockton, is 52%. And yes, everybody else is lower than that. So no, the central part of the state is not the economic wasteland. It is actually the growth margin in California. It is. This is where growth occurs because you build housing. And that is why people come here to live and you can have economic growth. Well, wages are so low, but even here, let's take a step back. Wages are low, not because there's something wrong in the economy, because it's a different kind of economy. Here's a breakdown, and I'm looking at earnings by educational attainment, 2011, 2019, and I'm comparing the entire state to San Joaquin Valley. By the way, if you have less than a high school degree, a high school graduate, or some college, you're making basically as much money here as you are everywhere in the state, right? It's as simple as that. Now, yes, if you go to graduate degrees, it's a lower pay rate, but then again, they have a bunch of, electrical engineering PhDs where you have more teachers and doctors and general medicine doctors. But for the lower income folks, actually just as high. And by the way, the upside is this, the housing is a lot cheaper here. So not only do you make the same money, but you spend substantially the lower part of your income on housing. So no, it's not a poor part of the state. If anything, if you aren't lucky enough to have gotten a bachelor degree, the center parts of the state actually offer you the best quality of life in the state. Now you can say, well, why don't we have as many PhDs? It's a different kind of economy. That's okay, you have ag out here. By the way, why is the unemployment rate higher in the central part of the valley? There's one reason only, ag is here. Any place you have ag, your unemployment rate is elevated. You take ag out of the picture, it doesn't look any different. And it doesn't matter where you are. It's always the same thing. You got to focus on the changes in unemployment, not the level, because the level doesn't tell you anything. So again, this part of the state is not in desperate need of economic revitalization. What it needs to be is left alone by people who only have policies that are good for San Francisco and West LA. Now, the biggest issue in California is actually a lack of housing, right? You have the second lowest housing units per capita. In fact, Gavin Newsom came into power basically promising 3 million new housing units, of which he's delivered none. And of course, as a result of that, prices continue to rise here. Now, by the way, they're rising everywhere. You look at the cost of living in California, it's 80% higher than everywhere else. It's been that way for the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. And that's again because we simply don't build enough. And people are leaving, they're moving, they're going to Arizona, you want to go to Oregon. And remember what I said. We live now in a period of labor scarcity. Demographics say there aren't enough people. From here on, for the next decade, I can tell you that economic development is going to boil down to labor attraction. It's as simple as that. In places like the Bay Area, they haven't fixed their housing situation. And as a result of that, here you have an amazing opportunity for the Central Valley. Continue the house building ways. Look for the industries. You're not going to biotech companies and high-tech firms are not going to provide it, but you don't need them because there's lots of other companies that don't want to compete with them for housing or an office space in San Jose, and they will happily move here. You already see it happen. Just look at the 680. Look what's happening in Tracy. Connect to that. The opportunities are better now than ever for this part of the world. And it even gets more interesting because of the work from home phenomenon. Remember what I said? Does not create new normals, but it accelerates them. According to a wonderful survey done by the Atlanta Fed, prior to the pandemic, about 10% of office days will work from home. After the pandemic, they expect about 30% to be work from home. And by the way, they're going to have to do that. Take a look at the right-hand side. This is workers' desired amount of post-COVID work from home days. A third said, I want to work from home all the time, and a third said, I never want to work from home. You know, there were some tech companies that said, oh, this is great, we're not going to have office space. Literally 30 people said, we will quit if you do that. Okay, everybody has to come back to the office. 30 people said, we will quit if you do that. So there's going to have to be a hybrid approach. Now, joking aside, you know, the easy joke here is if you don't want to work from home, it's because you have kids. Actually, it's the other way around. If you have kids, you want to work from home. If you don't have kids, particularly younger, you do want to leave the office. But again, think of the opportunities. What that means is there are going to be people who don't want to be crammed into a small place in San Francisco. They're going to have the option to go into the office once every 3 weeks, and they're going to look for a place to live, to raise their kids. They're going to want a safe neighborhood, a good school, a nice place, a nice house to live in. Look up the hills. Look at the beautiful places you have. They will come here. A whole other opportunity. But to do it, you have to build. You have to provide those things. There's a fantastic downtown here. We were walking around it today. You know, with some safety, you continue to work on upgrading these buildings. You give a great place to hang out at the end of the day. The opportunities are amazing for this part of the world. This is not about. Now, where are the worries? Well, there's that $9 trillion problem, right? And how overstimulated the economy, I won't dive into this, but look, for every dollar of lost earnings over the course of the last year and a half, the federal government gave Americans back $3.50. It was a 3.5 to 1 replacement rate. Unbelievable. I mean, it's over the top. They were sending checks out to everybody. 110 million people got checks, just subsidy checks. Now, to be clear, some of those people needed it, but the vast majority of them, their problem was they couldn't spend money. Giving people money when they can't spend money is not stimulus.
Good meeting here, Joaquin.
Is that me?
Did I give my escalator sale like a month ago? We still have it.
Okay. 80% of this
Supervisor
money.
Leopold, you're on speakerphone.
Can you tell us your password, please? Anyway, 80% of the money saved, paid down debt, donated, right? Just tickle the numbers here. Uh-oh. Am I cut off? There we go. Cumulative personal savings. $6.5 trillion in cumulative personal savings. $3.5 trillion in excess bank account deposits. This is coming into the third quarter of this particular year. Household aggregate net worth. Because, you know, all this money is set the financial markets on fire. Home prices are going up, right? The stock market, second highest PE ratio ever. Over the last year, 23% increase in household net worth. We've never seen anything like this before, whatever. Financial obligations ratio. Remember I told you we came to the pandemic with that at a record low level? It's now 2 percentage points lower than that. No wonder the credit markets are spotlessly clean, right? But what's the cost? Well, how about the $10 trillion in federal debt we picked up over the last decade? We went from, in 2000, we had a 58% gross debt to GDP ratio. Today it's 130%. Over doubled in 20 years. Okay, we're rich. Who's poor? Our children and our grandchildren. We just gave ourselves a ton of money, left the debt for them. Great for us. Tough to be a kid. Federal Reserve, you know, federal funds rate down to zero. $4 trillion in quantitative easing from Mr. Jerome Powell. That's more than what Janet Yellen did and Ben Bernanke did. Now, mind you, Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke were fighting a near collapse in the banking system, massive debt problems across the board, collapsing household wealth. Jerome Powell isn't dealing with any of that. What is he doing? What war is he fighting? I have no idea. I really don't. And this is what scares me more than anything else. Because look, when you put this kind of stimulus into the economy, inflation starts to kick in, prices. Now, Powell will tell you over and over again, well, this is because the supply chains are screwed up, right? Well, yeah, I get that in the short run, right? Inflation's up, commodity prices are up, energy prices are up. By the way, complete aside, I had a reporter call me the other day, and he's like, oh, this is terrible. I go, why is it terrible? Well, it's killing consumers. They can't buy it. They can't afford it. I go, excuse me. It's excessive consumer spending that's driving inflation, Chief. You got it completely backwards. Their demand is what's making this happen. He's like, oh yeah, doesn't really work, right? But with that in mind, at what point in time does the supply chain inflation become structural inflation? Well, the answer is soon. We've never had this much money in the economy relative to the size of the economy, ever. This is 20% more than we had back in the 70s when we had all those inflation problems. For him to stand there and say this is not inflation causing is either complete ignorance or total gaslighting. I don't know which one it is. But it's crazy what they're doing. And remember, ultimately, the reason we don't talk about the explosion in federal debt, because it doesn't cost us anything. You know, we've doubled debt to GDP, but the cost of debt relative to GDP is basically exactly the same because they've been the beneficiaries of the massive decline in interest rates. Well, what happens when inflation kicks in? What happens when the bond markets finally wake up and go, yeah, this is a problem? Well, the Federal Reserve has to take that cash away to fight inflation, and of course the government's going to see spikes and the cost of servicing their debt along with Social Security and Medicare. In theory, that should cause them to suddenly have to become fiscally conservative, which means some sort of problem on the fiscal side as well. It means a negative fiscal and monetary shock. Could that cause a recession? Yeah. Will it? I have no idea. Look, what I know is the next 2-3 years, we got $28 trillion of new household wealth in this nation. This economy is taking off. Simple as that. Out there some point in time in the future, we're going to have to pay the piper. In the meantime, the sky is blue. It's got to keep rocking and rolling. It's a great time to move this city forward. But, you know, I tell you what I tell my business clients. Make hay when the sun is shining, but man, be ready to climb into your bunker. Because somewhere out there are storm clouds. Somewhere out there are storm clouds. But in the meantime, things are good. So, with that, I'm going to wrap up, turn it over to Patrick. The V was the only logical outcome. It's exactly what happened. We had a little bit of slow growth in the third quarter. It's absolutely irrelevant. It's a supply chain effect. Aggregate demand is on fire. This economy is going to rock and roll for a few years, the new roaring 20s, but at some point in time, the sugar high wears off. Where we are then remains to be seen. Labor markets. The problems out there are very simple. Labor, it's a seller's market. It's a seller's market for homes. It's a seller's market for cars. It's a seller's market for labor. It's a seller's market in this economy. If you're worried about inequality, this is great news. If you're worried about your businesses, this is tough. They're going to have to get used to it. But it also creates that possibility. One thing that Modesto has, unlike the Bay Area, is you have a growing labor force. That is the secret to economic development in the future. As simple as that. Build it, they will move here, and they will continue to move your economy forward. It's simple. As for policy thoughts, number one, I keep asking the folks in D.C. and Sacramento, please take off your crisis hat. The crisis is over. Focus again on the long run. We desperately need a functional immigration policy. By the way, there's a lot of stuff going into this package. I would tell you the one thing going into this package that I really like, and I realize some people are just going, access social stuff. The pre-K education is the most logical thing this nation can do, bar none. The Europeans ran a labor shortage a long time ago. What did? They put a lot of child care out there, and as a result of that, the female participation rate in Europe is substantially higher than here. It is incredibly helpful for low-income families to be able to have two incomes. It's incredibly helpful for those kids to get into education before kindergarten. It is the easy. I would skip the high-speed rail and the roads and the bridges in a heartbeat if they would fund that program, because by far and away has the best NPV. And of course, Mr. Newsom, what is good for San Francisco is not good for the Central Valley. It's time to walk away from this nonsensical idea that the Central Valley is some economic wasteland. It's a different kind of economy, San Jose, which doesn't mean it's a bad economy.
Can you call him?
I have tried. He will not take my call. Apparently I'm not pretty enough. I don't know what it is. So we'll see. We'll see. Right? We'll see. So thank you very much for your attention. And with that, let me go ahead and turn it right over to Patrick, and we'll get on to the second part, the more important part of today's program. Thank you very much. What do you want to do? You tell me.
We had on the agenda a 15-minute segment for Q&A, if anybody had any questions.
We can do that, or we can do Q&A at the end, whatever you want to do. I'm easy. You want to ask
Do you
questions
want to
there?
save it for the...
Well, since we're fresh with you, why don't we,
Let's do it.
why don't we put you in the hot seat and ask a few questions? And that's a great 30-minute presentation.
By the way, I'd like to make my seat hot, if you can't notice by my slightly different than normal economic presentation. So, yeah.
Very informative information, and thank you, Jay, for this leg of it. We can go to the next point where we're going with this. Any questions from the board at this point? Supervisor Rickman.
Thank you, Chair. You know, you mentioned like storm clouds. When is that coming?
I don't know. Look, you know, you got these forecasters out there who tell you there's going to be a depression in 2031. They might be selling you the Brooklyn Bridge. Okay, forecasting, you can see pretty clearly for 2 years. It gets shaky at 4, 5 is a total pipe dream. Problem here is I don't know what the policy choices are going to be. Right? Will Jerome Powell start backing off? Maybe he will. Maybe he'll get some of this cash out of there before this becomes a real problem. I don't know. Maybe the federal government will clean up a bit. Not now, they haven't. I don't know. So you you know that there are growing problems, and it's really hard to say when it's going to break. And you know, I'll tell you, very similar. In 2003, I started worrying. I saw worrying signs and consumer credit, what was happening in housing, and I kept telling you, it's kind of worrisome. Well, when's it going to end? I don't know. It went on a long time. It didn't really start turning until early 07, and didn't turn out to a full recession until about mid-2008. Economies have a lot of momentum. So, I wish I could tell you. Well, actually, if I actually could tell you, I wouldn't, because I'd be out there being a multi-billionaire and I'd be floating around in my private island someplace. But realistically, I just can't give you that kind of answer.
Okay, that's the only one I really had for right now, so I'll reserve my time for later. But thank you very much. You know, when I asked for this report to be brought back and got in March or so, and yeah, this is very, very thorough, to say at the very least. So there's some really good information in here, and more information. I think, a lot of information that we didn't know. Hopefully it'll help, because one of my goals with bringing this back, we are getting the ARPA funds and so on. Unbelievable, that 140 billion. We haven't got the 70 million yet, right? The other 70 in the second half.
Oh, we'll get that in May.
How do we help businesses with that money?
Well, I think the biggest problem that Patrick and I had with this project, and I don't want to get ahead of it, but the problem is you don't have that many problems. So let's find, if you will, the best way of using this money in the way you can use it. And at some level, we have that nice little thing called fungibility. Because if you use that money over here to do these things that need to be done, that gives you a little more money over here to play with. And again, I'm going to go back to the idea that making basic investments in this community, in this economy right now, like I said, continue to work on downtown, work on the safety issues, continue to think about the kind of infrastructure you need to take advantage of what is almost assuredly going to be a continued desire to live out here, to move out here, to move businesses out here. Labor force expansion will create enormous upsides for this economy, but you have to make space for it, you have to make room for it. So that would be my suggestion to you, is take that, use this money for that, and then take those savings and put it over here.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Sure. Supervisor Wynn?
I appreciate your presentation. Obviously, you covered a lot of areas. Touch on a couple of things. One was interesting is that the poverty rate has changed, not for the negative, but for the positive.
Yeah, from 1920.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, because there was a lot of talk, especially with revenues, for the government, sales tax, property tax, et cetera, and that would take a dime. It went the opposite way. Actually, a lower revenue than we had expected. The other thing in regards to, the thing you touched upon in regards to investment, oftentimes we invest in, I'll use the term that we subsidize, so we put money into businesses as a reimbursement or some type of thing. But my experience is, first of all, there's this sense that this money is free. It isn't free. In fact, the residents, the taxpayers of San Joaquin County paid for this, so it's their money. Secondly, in regards to anything that we, as a government, are involved in, there's a main concern, because we can do the project, so to speak. It's the O&M that kills us. It's the ongoing. Or as you talk about, so what happens when the stimulus ends, whatever that happens to be, all the considerations we're talking about Washington. So I wouldn't want to start something that cut it off, because it only delays the inevitable, which can be dreaded.
Use short-term revenues for short-term needs.
Right. Well, and to be honest with you, short-term political benefit.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. In regards to the economic quality, it's interesting, 2016, 2019, because there was a difference in administrations in that period as opposed to other periods in our history. And also in regards to the, talk about going into a restaurant or buying a car. Well, the fact of the matter is, you can buy a car, it's already chips.
Yeah.
You go to a car lot, they're almost empty. And so that's something that has to return at some point in time. And then when you talk about the ports, actually the ports, if you look at and listen to the longshoremen and the operators, they actually had 2 shifts, 2 10-hour shifts. What was killing them, and frankly, the president's, admonishment to run 3 shifts is really nonsensical. The reason that they only had 2 shifts is they tried to fill at 3 in the morning till 7, but they couldn't even get truck drivers. And the reason they couldn't get truck drivers because there was no place to take the goods. So what's been happening for months has been they've been at maximum realistically, and by saying that we're going to run more shifts really means nothing.
And I apologize for my throwaway line on that front. To your point, it's a lot more than the shifts. It's the you're exactly right. The trucks are there, the containers aren't there. Where do you take it? Particularly in the ports here, we all know that you basically have to unload in the morning. Because if you unload in the afternoon, you're not going anywhere. Right. So, yeah, I mean, I hear you on that front.
Well, and the question, and we'll get into this later some other time, but, we've talked about, dredging our port to allow containers to actually come up from Oakland, et cetera. So I don't know whether this would be appropriate for this type of funding. In regards to the extension of East Bay, because my understanding is probably everywhere west of Livermore, there is no space available for expanding warehousing or anything else. It's all brought up, which puts San Joaquin County in the perfect position to allow them to happen. In regards to the retirements, it's interesting that the amount of people that retired, because a lot of people just walking away. And what we're starting to see now, because of the mandate, more and more people are retiring or going somewhere else in regards to it, and that's unfortunate. I would add a couple last things, and I'll turn over to Supervisor Miller, is that, I've seen, for example, in this county over several years, we've worked very hard, we in the county, our hospitals, our healthcare professionals, to provide individuals who can fill those positions, because when you talk about ICUs and hospital beds, the reality is oftentimes we don't have the staffing. And so 2 things that I would offer in regards to, as we talk about this further, is 1, investing in scholarships for individuals who can attend our community college in regards to child care licensing, to increase the numbers, because it doesn't matter how many facilities you have, if you don't have individuals to walk or to fill them, then you're not going to have the availability for those who need them to go to work. The second part is that our hospital, for example, at St. Joseph's, has a program where their goal is to actually train about 200 physicians at that facility, about probably 25% in psychiatric care. And the reason I bring that up is, again, what if we have an opportunity to invest in child care personnel, invest in healthcare professionals, in scholarships to allow more to attend those particular programs, because to me, that would be the long-term benefit as far as future pandemics, because now you have availability of resources.
My only caution on that is providing people scholarships to go to training is no good if they then turn around and take a job in Santa Clara County. So in a sense, you got to also have that. You want to have them come here, enjoy being here, and stay here. Which has been a challenge, I think, for a lot of the inland regions, which is encouraging people to stay here. And mind you, again, if you look at the relative cost of housing, and you think about the potential for a good quality of life out here, the time to make these investments and what I would call quality of life things is exactly right now. Because your points on childcare, for example, exactly right. These are the investments that when you make them right now will pay off for a long time, because, again, would you rather live in Stockton or in Tucson, Arizona?
Well, you're right, and Supervisor Miller had sit on our county hospital executive committee, and we both sit on our health plan of San Joaquin, which probably handles about 380,000 Medicare recipients. The reason I bring that up is because we're already dealing with that challenge in regards to training and having them. We do that at our general hospital all the time. But I know that there are programs where you do provide the subsidy or the scholarship, but there's also, like in the military, there is a catch that you have to serve X number of years to pay that back.
Right.
So there is an option. And all I'm saying is we need to invest in things for the future to prepare for the next pandemic, which is going to be somewhere, maybe the next wave, so to speak. So all I'm saying is, it would at least, I guess, deserve a discussion in regards to how we can prepare our personnel and fill a lot of the positions we have in this county that are currently, we don't have a shortage of jobs, and this is before the pandemic. We have a shortage of qualified applicants. That's the reality. So anyway, I'll turn over to Superintendent.
Vice Chair, would you? Sorry?
What?
Okay, you said?
Yeah.
Right. Supervisor Miller.
Thank you. Thank you for the overview. It was really interesting. Prior to holding elected office, I managed the downtown of Stockton. And the San Joaquin Partnership Commission on Economic Development study in 2006, so 15 years ago. One of the key things they said that should happen countywide was all the downtowns should focus on exactly what you said. They need to be places for people to gather. They need to be spruced up. They need investment. And so I think that definitely holds true today. The recession set all of them back. We have a group of folks here today from one of our business improvement districts who are hoping to speak under public comment. But that is exactly what they are looking to do, is hopefully that the county can help create some sort of a fund for matching funds that cities would match to help create some of these improvement districts.
And to be clear, I appreciate some of the problems you're having downtown right now, which, by the way, we're having in every single downtown in the state. So,
exactly.
In a sense, there is that, what I would call short-run issue, which as a state, we're finally going to have to face, we're finally going to have to face some real rules to finally deal with this crisis, because everybody's dealing with it. But don't let that discourage you from making these investments.
Correct. And I could not agree with you more in terms of making smart investments in things that perhaps aren't direct business grants, but provide all the support for the business and for the workforce we're going to need.
Yeah.
In terms of childcare, a big part of it is, 50% of the childcare providers close their doors. They couldn't maintain the distancing, they couldn't maintain the ratios, they couldn't turn a profit, they just closed their doors. Well, once you give up your license,
Hard to get right.
it's expensive. And so that's another area that perhaps we can maybe do something more in the form of forgivable
I agree on that, but I'm also going to go back to remember that, child care is not a high-paying income.
Right.
And these women who might have been women, they're typically women, and a lot of them are immigrants, and they may have options elsewhere now, and they may see a career path. This almost goes back to, we've been having some of this conversation with some groups around the state as well, which is this conversation, even the state level and the national level, talking about it. But it's the idea, if you will, of the professionalization of early childhood care and how that can change the dynamics in that particular industry. But there's no doubt it's expensive, and it's you have to focus on it. Again, I try to stay out of the political battles, because it just doesn't help my clients to get involved in that stuff. But from my perspective, it's amazing to me that we continue to fight over things like minimum wages, which just don't. There's no track record of a minimum wage being a successful economic policy. It's not the end of the world, but it's not successful either. Yet here you have a clear policy which has enormous MPVs, and for some reason we can't get it off the ground. And that for me is the most frustrating thing of all, when I see very good policies being hamstrung by bad policies, just because these bad policies are easier to explain, or they provide a slicker headline. And for me it's frustrating.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to the rest of.
Thank you very much, I appreciate that.
Just to finish up, I don't know if I have a question other than complimenting. It's really informative, actually. It's a counter narrative to what you hear in so many instances. And statistically, you would just want to delve into this for a second. You had talked about, I understand, there's 6 million less jobs.
6 million fewer payroll jobs.
6 million less, oh, okay.
Now, to be clear, the reason we have to be distinct about that is how we count jobs in this country, right? The labor force is coming out of the current population survey, and that's based on people. The payroll jobs has to do with jobs. Now, you may have multiple payroll jobs, right? Or you may not have a payroll job. I'm not a payroll worker because I'm self-employed, technically speaking. So the numbers are a little different. But the labor force has shrunk by 3 million. The number of payroll jobs is down by 6 million. But remember, a lot of those payroll jobs that are missing are like part-time jobs in restaurants and whatnot, right? So they're part-time jobs.
So of the 2 to 3 million that have retired, is that part of the 6 million less?
Well, that's causing the inability to get those jobs back. That's why we're seeing 6 million fewer jobs, because there's so many fewer people. And probably the people who are taking jobs, listen, I can get a full-time job. I'm not going to go work 3 part-time jobs when I can have a full-time job. So there's 3 payroll jobs missing, 1 full-time payroll job there. Hence, you end up with this kind of weird mismatch, if you will, between the numbers.
Got it. And then, so I was told a while back in one of the business forums I was attending that at the time, the anticipation was the baby boomers retiring, which you noted, there was a part of, basically, the narrative was in the next 10 years, 50% of the workforce would be going into retirement. And there wasn't an adequate supply coming behind that of trained, skilled labor.
Right.
Is that similar?
Those are extreme numbers, right? It's basically the replace. Right now, for every person who's retiring, we're basically adding 1.02 people to the labor force. But that's not enough to create 2% job growth per year, you know.
So wait, what was that statistic, please?
I think I'd have to go dig it up. And remember, this all moves because of where the economy is. Remember, prior to the pandemic, participation rates were level when, from a demographic standpoint, things have been going down because a lot of people were just staying in the workforce. Pandemic hits, we're stuck at home, and a lot of people said, this is a good time to retire as any. And a lot of people did. So it happened kind of suddenly. In the end, look, there's a couple things here to keep in mind. That we clearly need to fix our national immigration system. Who can swim the fastest over the Rio Grande is not an immigration system. We need a system that allows people to come in legally, at plentiful numbers, at all levels of skill, because we need the people. It's as simple as that. We have a basic shortage of people in this country. In the meantime, look, the shortage of labor is not the end of the world. You can still grow an economy, but you're going to have to grow it a different way. I mean, take restaurants, for example. Restaurants are just going to have to change what they do and how they do it. They're going to have to automate. They're going to have to go fast casual. You're going to be ordering at the bar, and someone's going to deliver your food at the table. It's just the way it's going to have to be. And God, 2 years ago, again, remember all the scare stories? The robots are coming to take our jobs. Oh, bring on the robots, people. We need them, right? So, we will get through this, but because it happened so dramatically, it's a real shock to the system, and it takes a while for the system to readapt, if you will, to the basic realities of labor supply. But again, if you're worried about inequality, the next decade will be one of the best for inequality in a very long time, because again, this is even the idea, for example, of worker training programs. A lot of well-minded people in 2010 were setting up worker training programs. But the problem with worker training programs in 2010 is there are a lot of people who had good work experience and they were going to get first crack at the job. Today, those worker training programs will pay off better than ever before. This is the time you get that guy coming out of that prison and you pull him to one side and you get him cleaned up, you get him trained, because it will pay off now because people need workers. So there's a lot of people you can help in this economy that you wouldn't have been able to a decade ago.
With vocational training is what you're saying?
Vocational training, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. And it is something that we've got different county board of education and public-private sector, we're having some meetings and looking at locations downtown that eventually myself and others will bring it to the board for.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I do know that I've got a question. Supervisor Via Pudua, are you able to take off mute and join us?
Hey. Yes, I am. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
And thank you for the conversation. It's wonderful listening to you guys speak. Just had a question regarding cryptocurrencies in our economy.
Yeah.
With cryptocurrencies seem to be taking over, how do you think it's going to affect our future with hard cash and so forth?
Yeah, I don't think they're going to be taking over our future, to be honest with you, sir. I'm not a big believer in cryptocurrencies. And the problem with cryptocurrencies is there's no, I mean, you can have an infinite number of cryptocurrencies, so by definition, how can any one of them have a value per se, right? It has the basic inflation problem that all money has if there's no controlling, if you will, supply. Now, I know there's a X number of say, Bitcoins, but you could have an infinite number of Bitcoin-type products, which is where the problem comes from. So, for me, I'm more concerned about Bitcoin because I feel like it's an asset bubble of sorts, and I don't know what's going to happen if it pops. Now, with that in mind, I know people are out there dealing in cryptocurrency. I've had one too many people tell me, well, I've made money in it, and to which I point out my mother made money in Beanie Babies in 1988. It doesn't mean it's a long-run sustainable asset, so just be careful while you're doing this. But by the way, you got to be a little older to understand that comment. By the way, I appreciate that.
I'm old enough.
Well, me too, right? So, like I said, I would be cautious about that market just because, again, it doesn't seem to be a lot of there. But you know, it's kind of wait and see mode, if you will. Speaking of narratives, there's a wonderful book.
Well, thank you for the information.
Yeah. Good. All right.
Book on,
Oh, I was just going to say Narrative Economics by Robert Shiller. We were talking about narratives, and he starts out talking about Bitcoin and how the power of the narrative has created this phenomenon called Bitcoin. It's kind of a fun read.
well, unless you have major government investment into it, it's not, if it
Well,
comes
no,
and
that's
goes
what
and
people
bubbles and,
Yeah, but people say, oh, it's electronic currency. You have an electronic currency. It's called the U.S. dollar.
right,
99% of the U.S. dollar is electronic. It's just on a computer someplace. It's not real.
right.
So the only difference here is this is an electronic currency that isn't run by a government. It's limited by this blockchain technology.
Understood. Supervisor Rickman.
Thank you, Chair. And just to clarify something, Supervisor or Chairman Patty still collects Beanie Babies. And you mentioned earlier about the housing market leads to economic growth, right? And, you know, there's a lot of talk about affordable housing. We're in a community town, pretty much. I think every city in this county commutes over the hill. Now, do you have any recommendations and what we can accomplish at a local level? Because this is the frustrating thing is you hear about affordable housing, you hear our governor tout it every other week, right?
Yeah, I know.
But, and they put the blame on local government, counties and cities, but the policies like CEQA, for example, comes out of the state, and the states aren't changing their practices. I mean, I got it, over $1 million just to get a development started.
Right.
So, you know, we talk about bringing the house price down, but, you know, by supply and demand, have more supply, but you can't have more supply because you have things like CEQA and all these regulations.
You can't. You can't. Look, ultimately, housing, the ability to build housing is a local choice.
Right.
Yes, there are state policies that get in your way if you let them. For example, a very simple solution to this is to rezone and do a lot of stuff by right. Riverside City did an amazing job of this. A few years ago, they redid their general plan, they rezoned a bunch of stuff, and they put in a bunch of zoning, and it was by right, which means it's all set up, it's there, and as long as you follow the rules, there can be no CEQA challenges. It's done. So there are ways of getting around that. Jerry Brown, when he was mayor of Oakland, they built more housing units in Oakland when Jerry Brown was there for 8 years than they did in the 8 years before and the 8 years after him. Together, he built way more because it's Jerry Brown. I said, build it, get on my face. And they did. So you can do it, but you just have to go through and figure out the policy levers to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that come in along the way. And of course, as the county, you got to be focused on the unincorporated areas because the cities have their own kind of planning and they're going to have their own issues, but you can encourage them as well. So there are ways of doing it, the ways of avoiding those problems, as long as you understand what they are and get in front of them. And as far as that goes, if you need some help on that, we'd be happy to help you sometime.
Great, because you talk about CEQA and it's a price factor, but it's also a time factor. And you can say by right and all these different programs, but the counties or cities aren't in the business is business.
Right, no, I get that,
You
yeah.
have to have developers willing to make a profit of whatever it may be.
And, absolutely, and again, so let me just put this out in general. I'm thrilled to be here, I'm so glad Jay invited me in. Look, we do work all over the place, and we did this plan an hour before you. If you want to talk about housing, we'd love to come in and talk about housing. If you need this data to be produced on a regular basis for your county to show these developers that no, this isn't the pit of the state, the way Gavin Newsom seems to act, but in fact is one of the fastest growing parts of the state with these phenomenal assets, we'd be happy to do that too. Just ask, we're here. I'd love to work with you guys, because there are ways of doing this, and yet again, I'm an economist. I just look at the numbers and tell you which way, the wind's blowing. I got a bunch of break-in guys who do the hard work and get down there and figure this stuff out.
All right, cool, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I have a question, one more
Sure.
follow-up.
Yeah.
We talked about, and there is a narrative that Silicon Valley is the economic engine for the state of California, and we've got, again, being the 5th largest economy in the world.
Yeah.
What percentage, if you removed Facebook, Google, and Amazon and all that from,
Minuscule.
really? This is very informative to me, because I would have thought it was a very large component of our economy.
No, in fact, I have those numbers. I can find those old slides and pull it out for you, but it's nowhere near what you think.
I'd love to get a breakdown of what we actually have, what is diverse, or what the segments of our economy are,
Sure.
and how it might be regionally relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, there's all sorts of data on that, but no, the Bay Area is not a significant source. Because remember, technology's taken off. It's a big part of the Bay Area, but because they don't build enough housing, the other parts of their economy are getting pushed out. So other kind of core historical parts of San Jose are moving to other parts of the state or other parts of the U.S. as the case may be. So it's not like they're just exploding and everybody else is fading away in the shadow. And indeed, look, the Bay Area is still getting a huge amount of venture capital. We know all the startups still happening. No, they're not running off to Austin as the case may be. But I'll tell you, as a guy who lives in West LA, I'll tell you they're all opening offices now. They're opening them in West LA. Because again, there's really just, San Francisco's hard to do work in. And boy, the city of San Francisco, don't even go there. I mean, they're just, that place is a train wreck from a regulatory standpoint. The fact that anything gets done in that city nowadays is amazing.
Understood. All right, well, thank you very much. Looking
My
forward to
pleasure.
the next phase
Thanks
of
so
our
much.
presentation.
All right, well, hello. Thank you to Jay and thanks to the staff here for this engagement. We've learned a lot. And speaking about, where we are in the proceedings, I think Chris has actually done a lot of the hard work here because he has dispelled some of the myths that might be prevailing going into a project like this. And in some ways, he's actually made my job a little bit harder because there's a kind of paradox at the heart of this project, and I'd like to get into that in just a minute. But just a few remarks at the outset. I think this project is actually kind of special. Actually, I know this project is kind of special because in March, Beacon Economics, we were open for business. We do economic development work. We help communities with all kinds of economic challenges. And absolutely no one was coming to us to talk about ARPA. You folks, in your infinite wisdom, I believe, came to us. You wanted some help to think through how to spend a ridiculous amount of money. And we were, of course, more than happy to oblige. But something very interesting has happened in the ensuing months. So no one wanted to talk to us in March. But beginning in around September and certainly through October, a lot of counties want to talk to consultants about ARPA. We're seeing a lot of RFPs from counties that have maybe started to spend money and then said, wait a second, are we going to get audited for this? How do we comply with this? They're kind of, doing things maybe in the not ideal order of operations. So you folks, in your wisdom, said, we're going to have all this money. How are we supposed to spend this? Not only spend this so that we as a county keep our noses clean and make sure we're doing things legally, but so that we actually leverage this money, spend it in, as Chris was saying, a fungible way that's going to allow us to use this money for these specific uses to set up a long-term strategy of prosperity, of economic development. So, that's the theory of this project, and, we're just more than happy to oblige. And like I said, we've learned a lot here. Jay, when he pitched this project to us, says, it's like Brewster's Millions. And, the first thing I did was I watched Brewster's Millions. And then what I came to find out is that Brewster's Millions is this wonderful Richard Pryor movie where someone inherits a lot of money and they have to spend it all in these weird ways. This project has kind of, in fact, resembled that movie. But I think the end product is going to be much better, not just for you folks, but for your constituents.
Are we going to be playing the Yankees?
Do you want to? What baseball team do people root for up here?
Giants.
All right, sorry guys. Listen,
All right.
that's not who we root for.
Stay silent.
Yeah. Well, maybe that will be the most contentious part of this presentation. Anyway, what I want to do with you folks is take you through ARPA just a little bit, just so we have some basic understanding of what's at stake here. And then, the main value that we can provide to a county like San Joaquin is to provide information, provide analysis of that information. And so I'm really going to lead the way by talking about San Joaquin's pandemic. And this is where we get into the paradox that I was just alluding to. The paradox is that San Joaquin, as Chris was saying, its economy has done quite well, thank you very much. But there's still some significant public health challenges, and there have been through the whole duration of the pandemic, some public health challenges that the county should look after. And balancing these principles is kind of the heart of our strategy. So we want to talk about the pandemic, we want to talk about the conditions, and that is background to launch into the strategy that we prepared for you folks. Now, what is a strategy? A strategy is a set of priorities. It's a set of values, really. Here's how you should spend this big pot of money. What it is not is a script. It's not us as outsiders who don't know this county nearly as well as you coming in and saying, here's exactly how you should spend that money. It is giving you a sense of what should you prioritize and what should you value. So let's talk about ARPA just off the top. When you talk about all this money that's been recently injected into the economy, so there's ARPA, and there's CARES, and there's the quantitative easing from the Federal Reserve. ARPA is the portion of that came out in March of this year, American Rescue Plan Act, huge amount of money, $1.9 trillion. And of that, $350 billion is set aside for areas like San Joaquin County in local aid. It's an act of Congress. When it was being crafted, it was the idea is that it would be quick relief, just get money into communities. But of course, as you folks know, it's hard to get money into communities. It's hard to apportion money in March and then get it into communities. And in keeping with my earlier remarks, you really want to measure twice and cut once when you're spending a bunch of money. When you're spending a bunch of money guided by an act that you don't kind of fully understand. Now, speaking of an act you don't fully understand, believe it or not every representative or senator who voted on this legislation read it before they voted on it. This is very common. And then you end up with an act like ARPA, and you're sending money out to communities, and they're like, how do we spend this? What you inevitably get in this situation is an interim final rule where, in this case, the Treasury Department is clarifying on exactly what you can and can't do with the money. So the interim final rule is the rule of law around ARPA right now, and thankfully, and I have to really credit the Treasury Department on this, through the interim final rule and through a series of frequently asked questions and consultations that the Treasury has done with communities, it's become easier and easier to understand exactly what you're allowed to do with this money. So just a bit more about, in the way of background of our engagement with you folks. We don't sell answers.
at Beacon. So, we don't work with folks who say, hey, can you please tell us to spend money on universal basic income or something. Like this policy proposal, we're really looking for a consultant who will tell us to do that. We don't do that. We're affiliated with the university. We are economists. We try to think about this as a research project. And so we try to be very independent. And lo and behold, a lot of the advice that we've given to the county, both now in October and during our mid-project update, is very consistent with what the county was already doing. I think Jay put it around like 75%, which I really think is the magic number, because you want to get some kind of value out of your engagement with us. But if we're telling you that you should spend money on X and you're spending 100% of money on Y, then someone's wrong. And, we don't want it to be us. And we like to argue too. So 75% overlap is really good. In terms of the deliverables, we did do the mid-project update over the summer. Final report we just sent out last week. And then we've also prepared, and I really have to give a shout out to administrative staff here at the county, a list of actual businesses using county records that might be targeted with some aid. So speaking of the interim final rule and guidance from the Treasury Department, at this point, it's really not such an opaque bucket of money, or such an opaque piece of legislation to guide how you spend your bucket of money. First and foremost, if you're spending money to address COVID-19 mitigation or treatment, you are definitely on the right track, and you should be very confident in what you're doing, and we notice this considerably. You can replace public sector revenue loss. And if we were advising a different county, and Dr. Thornburg talked about counties who are heavily dependent on tourism, for whom this is extremely relevant. If we were advising a different county, this might be a bigger part of the strategy we prepared. It's less of a part of the strategy we prepared here. Water and sewer infrastructure. We tend, as a society, to not invest as much in infrastructure that we can't see. And even though the link between water and sewer infrastructure and the pandemic itself might be among the most speculative, it still is useful for a lot of communities that there is explicit funding set aside, or it's explicitly set aside in ARPA that you can support water and sewer projects with this money. Negative economic impacts, when we're talking about individuals and families who have been directly impacted by the pandemic and the economic fallout that's happened in some sectors. When we're talking about businesses in the same position, this is what we're talking about. Premium pay for essential workers, we're going to get into this. The idea that, on the front lines of this pandemic, there have been a much relatively smaller number of people, and can we as a society pay them back, reward them for the sacrifices they've made? The ARPA legislation imagines this. And then finally, broadband infrastructure is explicitly set aside. So you'll notice, in terms of infrastructure, it's very specific what you're allowed to spend money on. And this is probably, if I were to analyze it, and I'm an amateur political analyst, anticipating an infrastructure bill that's coming down the pike where there's much more infrastructure money available. But fungibility is key. If you care about infrastructure, that's not provided for here, it still matters that you're given money to do other things, because if you take care of those needs, there might be other funds available later. There are, and this especially comes out in the FAQs issued by the Treasury Department, off-limits uses. And some of this was disappointing to us, because we are, especially in my part of Beacon Economics, we're economic development people. We love to do long-term economic development. And the folks at Treasury are pretty squeamish about using ARPA money to do traditional economic workforce development. So that's one thing, and there's certain provisions guiding that. Direct pension deposits are verboten. Debt service is verboten. You're not supposed to use this opportunity to get ahead of where you were as a county, for instance, or as a municipality before the pandemic. And infrastructure projects that have not been expressly defined. So you really, when you look over all the guidance issued by Treasury, you want to make sure you don't step on these third rails. As part of our early consultation, we were paying a lot of attention to what other communities were doing, especially other counties. And here, this is just looking at documentation that we assembled and found about how other counties were spending. Here are some of the categories that that spending was falling into. You see that housing is kind of tied for second here, human services, health number one, and on down the list. So, and here are some examples of specific things that were being done. And once again, we do get into the specifics, but we are not political officials here on the ground in San Joaquin. We don't know what political tools are available in the toolkit. So really, where we are most useful is kind of at a level just above. It's like you can pursue any kinds of objectives, or many kinds of objectives with your ARPA spending. What kind of priorities make sense given the economic and public health conditions on the ground here? So now let's get into those conditions. At the end of the day, the public health situation here in San Joaquin County has been relatively dire relative to the state at large. So if you look at overall COVID-19 mortality rates, it's about the fifth worst levels. And so this is during the entire pandemic here in San Joaquin, and it's significantly higher than in the median California county. Okay, so here we see kind of the unfortunate leaders on this statistic. And when you net things out, so what we had to do for this analysis is we took normal deaths, normal deaths in I believe it was the year before, we took deaths in 2020 from other things that weren't associated with coronavirus, and we compared them to kind of normal sources of death. And coronavirus is not the top, but it's up there. And when you consider that our society during normal times is set up to do things about heart disease, to do things about cancer and accidents and all these sorts of things, and you consider that coronavirus is about the third, and before 2019 or before 2020 we didn't know what it was, then you get pretty sober about the realities and the sorts of resources that need to be invested at the county level, at the federal level, in retrofitting basically the society for this public health challenge. And a lot of this, obviously the political discussions during coronavirus have really centered on things like social distancing and government shutting down the economy and all these regulations that were put into place like immediately when COVID came. But what we oftentimes forget is that by virtue of a number of factors, different counties were somewhat differently vulnerable to COVID-19. And unfortunately, and this changes throughout the pandemic, so I'm referring to this vulnerability model that comes from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Unfortunately, at the very beginning of the pandemic, so this is March of 2020, San Joaquin County was in the 99th percentile of COVID-19 vulnerability at that time. And so what does this mean? What does it mean to be more vulnerable? Well, there's a larger essential workforce. So when we talk about some of the great stories in warehousing and logistics, well, the other side of this is these are essential workers. When we're talking about people in agriculture, these are essential workers. When you have a community that's somewhat more specialized in these activities, where you don't really have the luxury of being able to shut down this part of the economy, there's going to be more exposure. It just sort of comes with the territory. There's relatively more air pollution in this county compared to other counties. This has to do with normal climatic concerns. And this county is, this would be surprising to folks who haven't spent much time here. It's surprisingly dense. It's got a surprising number of amount of population density, and this is part of the model. So, I mean, basically what this is saying is that when you look, oh, excuse me, I'm trying to go back. Oh, did I just go back 3 slides? I'm sorry. Can you go back one more slide? Yeah. So when you, or, yeah, great. So when you try to explain that mortality, you know, you don't have to put the blame at anyone's feet. It's just some counties, by virtue of their economic structure, going to be more vulnerable to COVID-19 in 2020, and lo and behold, that model is proven pretty correct. Okay, so at the beginning, speaking of March 2020, remember the beginning of the pandemic, what the focus was on. The focus was on bending the curve. The focus was on taking actions as communities so that hospitals were not over capacity. Now, as the supervisor mentioned in his questions earlier, you know, hospital utilization and ICU utilization specifically, this isn't just about physical plants. It's not just about the physical infrastructure. There's a lot of human infrastructure that goes into this. But the bottom line is the same. If you look at this just basic ICU utilization, in the state as a whole, we were in trouble during the spike last winter. In San Joaquin County, we became in trouble in the spike last winter, and we haven't quite yet returned to a normal level of ICU utilization. And even if you look at the Delta spike later in the summer this year, it never quite hit that red part according to this visualization. So it's not just the deaths, which are by themselves concerning. And one more thing I want to point out about the deaths. When we as economic development folks talk about job multipliers, it's usually a very positive discussion. So when we're saying a logistics operation is about to be built in Tracy, we might say there's going to be 1,000 direct jobs and there's going to be some multiplier of new jobs. The reason why economists should care a lot about COVID-19 is because multipliers go the other direction too. If you start taking people out of the economy, prime-age workers out of the economy, even before you get to some of the labor shortages that Dr. Thornburg was talking about.
I apologize, Patrick. I'm going to have to interrupt for a moment. Supervisor Joaquin can't hear the speaker right now, so if you could just wait a moment and double check what's going on to make sure that he can hear what's happening.
You cannot hear the speaker?
He can't hear the speaker. Yeah, he said he can see the slides, but he can't hear anything that's going on right now.
Is ISD looking at it? Thank you.
Did you turn the volume up?
It's probably my fault.
Something you could fix?
Supervisor Joaquin, are you able to hear me speaking at this moment?
No way you can call in?
Well, he is participating.
I mean, a different, you know, sound.
You can always view the public feed of the YouTube feed. He can join.
Are you trying to get on YouTube? Yes. Okay, you can see, but you can't hear anything, even if Rochelle called your name. Could you hear Rochelle when she asked you if you could hear?
Yeah, but I'm just saying.
We are here. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. You got that online? Okay, we're good.
Thank you, Chairman.
I was really working myself into a lather, and now I gotta lather up again.
Cut out your zone.
Okay, so, where were we? Okay, can I go back one slide, sorry? Yeah, so we're not out of the woods in San Joaquin County when it comes to just the basic public health bending the curve concern. And now we get into what is the pandemic today when we're talking in October versus the pandemic at the beginning of this red spike in last December.
Miguel's off again. ISD is playing games with you, they're laughing. So,
Can he just dial in? I mean, that's what I was referring to, instead of, you know,
can you dial in? Were you dialed in before?
for him to dial.
well, does somebody have a telephone? They can call in, you can put on speaker. So we can.
You're on YouTube again? Testing 1, 2, 3. You can hear us now, okay? Bye.
Can you start over?
Okay, so what's the difference now versus when the spike started? I mean, the big difference is, like, in December, if I could have told the folks working at the hospitals, you know, what if I had a magic wand that would make COVID mortality drop considerably, that would be like a kind of seatbelt for the car accident that's COVID mortality, people would have loved it. And lo and behold, thankfully, you know, thanks to a lot of the work done, you know, early in the pandemic by the last presidential administration, Operation Warp Speed, we got something up to speed that was exactly like this. And I want to make this comparison very strong because I think the COVID vaccine was sold inappropriately by some of its boosters originally. The COVID vaccine was never going to be some fail-safe provision that was going to stop infections or completely stop mortalities, any more than seatbelts were ever going to stop traffic fatalities. But if you actually compare these two prophylactics against fatality, COVID vaccines work better than seatbelts, and you know, seatbelts work pretty well. 47% of traffic fatalities involve victims without seatbelts. That's pretty bad. 98% of COVID mortality involves the unvaccinated. If you look at just basic rates, this is coming from a CDC published study from, I believe, last week. Published last week. 1.43 deaths per 100,000 for Pfizer vaccines, 0.73 for Moderna vaccines, and 13.23 for the unvaccinated. So anyone who's saying that vaccines stop COVID mortality or infection is selling the Brooklyn Bridge. But this is a major tool. It's a major public health tool to reverse the spike and make sure that the public health situation in a place like San Joaquin County can be as rosy as the economic situation that we've been talking about for most of this afternoon. So, you know, when you look across space, across the geography of the United States, you really do start to appreciate that there's a pandemic of the unvaccinated, where the relatively lower vaccinated states have relatively higher levels of fatality. So this is, we've done this analysis since April, so since vaccines came on. You know, so basically, in the language of this graph, there's red states and there's blue states. It's not political, but like blue states with relatively higher vaccination, relatively lower mortality. There are strange states like Florida. So Florida has relatively higher vaccinations and also relatively higher mortality. As best as we can explain it, it's because there's a lot of vaccine tourism there. So a lot of folks go to, especially earlier in the pandemic or earlier in the vaccination campaign, went to Florida from places in South and Central America and boosted vaccine numbers. But again, getting away from the main story here, and that's, if you look within the state of California, there's the same sort of spatial relationship. So this is counties within the state, and you see this general negative relationship where a higher vaccination rate means lower mortality. And again, it's just like with seatbelts. It's not a policy panacea. It's not something that's going to completely drive down the transmission of the disease. But in the toolbox that we have, this is a major tool. Okay, and now let's consider San Joaquin during this vaccination period. How is San Joaquin doing? Well, it's doing a little bit better. And I'll tell you that San Joaquin's campaigns, or not necessarily the campaigns, but its ability to vaccinate its most vulnerable folks, that's 65 and over, has been relatively better. But San Joaquin County has still had higher mortality rates during this vaccine era. It's still, not quite getting the job done. Okay, so quickly, and this is bouncing the rubble just a little bit based on what Dr. Thornburg said. I want to talk about some of the economic conditions in the state or in the county. You have a situation where, in part because of structural reasons like the agricultural attachments of this county, San Joaquin County had higher than average in the state unemployment rates. And at various points during the pandemic, that gap has closed completely. And even now, that gap is a lot smaller than it was going into the pandemic. So, you can tell a very dismal story that unemployment is up in this county since the beginning of the pandemic, and sure you'd be right, but the relative story is pretty encouraging. And the relative story, when you start to dig into the numbers, is actually even more encouraging. Just really quickly, and this is very important background when we talk about what kinds of things should a county like San Joaquin be using ARPA money for. Government transfers have been a big part of why personal incomes have increased, and this is national data, during the pandemic. So there's more personal income today than there was before the start of the pandemic. A lot of this is unemployment insurance that's gone way up. Periodic checks from the government for everyone, employed or unemployed, as long as they make under a certain income. Those haven't hurt either. But you have a situation where, relatively speaking, the unemployment rate has dropped, and then odds are that some of the most vulnerable to the exposure to the pandemic, those very folks who are unemployed, have gotten a lot of support already. Even before ARPA rolls out, help has been on the way for them, and they've been doing a little bit better. The final part of this analysis would be what we call a shift share analysis. What a shift share analysis, and okay, this is nerd time. This is like 3 slides of nerd time, so just bear with me. What a shift share analysis tries to do is disaggregate major changes in something like unemployment into different parts. So if I tell you that unemployment has changed in San Joaquin County, well, you can say, oh, well, unemployment has changed in the country as a whole. If I tell you unemployment has changed in some industry in San Joaquin County, like restaurants, you can say, well, restaurants in the country as a whole have also had large unemployments during the pandemic. And then once you net out those effects, you recover a regional effect, what we call the competitive share, which really gets at what's going on in San Joaquin specifically. And I think one of the important things that we were able to do in this project is think in terms of competitive share. Think in terms of the areas that are doing relatively worse in San Joaquin County, because these are areas that if you're just going by the national industry shares, you're maybe going to be missing. And then when you start to think about long-term economic development planning, this sort of analysis is what's going to tell you the green shoots for the new economy. When you talk about resiliency, setting up the economy of the future, it's this kind of analysis that's going to be very useful. So just very quickly, this is just review. And again, this is like 2 out of 4 nerd slides. 890 total jobs lost in crop production in San Joaquin County. About 190 of those, mathematically, you can attribute to national trends across all industries. About 817, 190 gain, like you would expect 190 gain in national trends, 817 lost due to trends in crop production, 263 lost due to San Joaquin specific trends. So let's look at the final ledger. What industries have done relatively worse in San Joaquin versus other regions in the country, other regions in the state? Well, social assistance, you see, lost about 1,600 jobs total, but about 1,300 of those jobs, specifically in San Joaquin, had to do with San Joaquin specific factors. So, if you're thinking about how unemployment insurance is set up, if you're thinking about other provisions that are already active in the labor force, from national sources, they probably have already baked in some understanding of restaurant suffering or independent contractors, gig workers suffering. They do not have this understanding that you kind of need at the San Joaquin level of social assistance or crop production or educational services being relatively worse off as a result of the pandemic. So our big recommendation to you folks when you talk about what kind of business targeting, what kind of business supports to offer, is to really think in terms of what areas of the economy have been especially worse off in San Joaquin County. But there's a kind of silver lining to all this, and that is that there are areas of the economy that have, in real terms, done better during the pandemic than before the pandemic. And we've already started to hear about those. I mean, in fact, for our cover photo for the report, we chose the port logistics operations, warehousing and storage, gained 5,000 jobs. About 2,800 of those jobs you can attribute to what's going on specifically here. There's administrative and support services, which I'm sure if you look into it, a lot of those could be attributed to administrative and support for the logistics industry. Truck transportation obviously has a very obvious link to the logistics industry. And then another interesting thing is food manufacturing. So on the previous slide, crop production, so this is the actual direct production of agricultural goods, that has declined. But the relatively more value-added section of this, food manufacturing, has actually done relatively well. What I'm here to say is that if we're doing a strictly economic development plan for you folks, we would say you want to do a little bit more as a share of your total economic activity in food manufacturing. You want to capture more of that value chain. And the natural, organic trends in the economy are kind of moving there already. So that's a great green shoot.
Define food, I'm sorry, just to interrupt while we're there. Define food manufacturing, what's that consist of?
So you take an onion out of the ground and you turn it into onion paste. That's food manufacturing. The taking it out of the ground is the previous slide. The onion paste is this slide. Wine. Wine is food manufacturing. Absolutely.
What's beverage?
I mean, what?
Beverage
manufacturing. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yes. But if you are manufacturing inputs into wine production, I don't know. I'm out of my depth here, but I imagine there's some kind of processed food that goes into beverage manufacturing, right?
It's just a different sector.
Yeah, right. But I'm talking about upstream the inputs into the wine sector. Anyway, these value-added aspects of the supply chain of like getting food from the crops onto people's plates is something you want to do more of anyway, and it's already going well. Food services and drinking places, this is very interesting. This has, of course, been front and center in how people conceptualize the pandemic, and relatively speaking, San Joaquin has done better here. So this doesn't mean you don't help out food services and drinking places, although you should be very careful for a reason I'll get into in just a second about how you do that. But it does mean that, relatively speaking, you should pivot a little bit more to other sectors that have been especially hurt here, because those are the very sectors that other federal programs, other state programs probably aren't envisioning or paying as much attention to.
Not to go off topic, but we actually did maybe 2 years ago a study for the CMTA, California Manufacturing.
Chris, can I ask you to speak into the microphone?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Is this on?
No.
So a couple years ago, we did a program, project for the CMTA, which is about basically rural manufacturing in the state. And it was kind of an interesting project talking about what should be going on out there. And actually, food manufacturing, beverage manufacturing were, and food manufacturing were top of the list. And we gave them a bunch of suggestions about how they could work with local manufacturers, because the problem isn't a demand. Yet again, it goes back to a labor availability. A lot of manufacturers want to operate there, and they just can't get people in the door. We can get a copy of the study over to you if it's something you'd like to look at.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
So we've got, in San Joaquin County, a lot of this is a continuation of trends that were established prior to the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, if you look at what we call location quotients, the location quotient is just a sense of how specialized an area is in a certain sector relative to the national trends. Stockton was, so this is the Stockton metropolitan area, was the second most specialized, second only to Laredo. This is pre-2020. And obviously, this trend is only intensifying. We're only adding more logistics jobs into this economy now. And this is pretty significant. This is pretty significant from the standpoint of, what does an ARPA plan look like for San Joaquin versus anywhere else? You can't have an off-the-shelf approach, especially when you're dealing with a region like San Joaquin, because for the most part, this trend from normal retail to e-retail has been an unmitigated disaster for local communities. It's been much worse sale tax receipts, among other things, worse employment on Main Street. Here, it's quite different. This has not been uniformly bad. In fact, if you're thinking about the sorts of economic development clusters that you want to form here in order to create broad-based prosperity here, you're looking exactly at the sectors that have done well as normal traditional retail has fallen off a little bit. And green manufacturing, as I've mentioned, is another green shoe. All right, now we've done enough preamble. Let's get into the strategy. So, in a nod, I guess, to the dire public health situation here, we talk about a triage system. And, again, our goal is to help you prioritize things. It's to give you some recommendations about what, among all the many possible goals that you might adopt as a county spending this money, how you might prioritize. So if you just list off all the things that you might want to do, and if you were to do a public consultation with charrettes and surveys and all this sorts of things, focus groups, and say, what kind of things should the county seek to do with ARPA money, they would probably come up with each of these things. Like, you want to prioritize direct pandemic aid. You want to actually help fight the disease that's still looming. You want to reward frontline workers. You want to prepare for subsequent waves. You want to make sure that any money you're spending on businesses and workers can actually be used, or is going to places where it's going to be used. Seize workforce development opportunities where they're available. Maximize transparency. Minimize monitoring costs. To the supervisor's point from earlier, maybe someone who's pretty savvy would say, don't take on new commitments, new obligations fiscally that you won't be able to service in 5 or 10 years' time. The headline here is there's no shortage of goals that you can embrace when you go into an exercise like this. But of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Even though there's a lot of money coming into the economy, it's not an infinite amount of money. You can't, unfortunately, mine Bitcoin in order to get more of this money, so you have to prioritize. There has to be some sense of what you're going to do, and that's exactly what this triage system that we put together seeks to think through. Oh, and the final thing, and this is very important, is you don't want to crowd out later sources. So if you know, as we happen to know, that a lot of infrastructure money is coming in the pipeline, then maybe you don't spend all your money on infrastructure money. Or by the same token, if you know that this might be the most obvious and best funded tranche of money to do public health investments related to COVID-19, then you probably don't want to miss out on that opportunity. So here's the triage system. We say, and it's orange to blue, so the orange is what we consider to be very, very important. And then as you work your way down, you kind of make sure that each level is sated, that each level is taken care of as you work your way down. This is sort of how we envision money being spent here in San Joaquin. So we're just going to go through each of these 4 areas, but at the top, we got to win this thing. We got to win the pandemic. It's nothing we can't do. It's nothing that is beyond any capabilities for public health officials or governance officials here. Let's do it. Let's go win this thing. Let's also, while we're very encouraged by the average statistics in a lot of industries, while we're very encouraged by these green shoots in the economy, we need to recognize that there might be people and businesses that have fallen through the cracks on previous sorts of aid. You want to make sure that you take care of them. You want to use individual and business aid very rationally and make sure that you're taking care of the people who maybe fell through the cracks. Hazard pay is something that we agreed makes sense. This gets at ethical obligations. This gets at making the people who have sacrificed things a little bit more whole. And then infrastructure. Infrastructure matters. There's certain infrastructure projects that are very eligible for ARPA money, and we encourage you to look at them. So I want to just kind of at each level of this framework talk through how you should think about it. And you know, there's pros and cons of doing any of this. So if you're talking about the orange level of our triage, investing in prevention, testing, vaccination, treatment, you know, the benchmarks for this are actually pretty clear. You want to take those statistics that I was presenting earlier on, and you want to reverse them. You want to do, if we're thinking about splits, if we're thinking about the October to January split, for instance, you want to not be so far ahead the county or the state median, excuse me, in terms of COVID mortality. It's very easy to understand if you're winning the pandemic, fortunately. Another advantage of spending money on the public health system is it fulfills the spirit of the law. You're not going to get audited by Treasury for spending money on reducing transmission. It's addressing an identifiable need that goes back to that clear benchmarks I was just talking about, broadly compliant. Some disadvantages here are, public health spending is such that it's hard to get it exactly right. Maybe you buy way too much PPE. Maybe you expand somehow, and I'm not saying this is the easiest thing, the ICUs, so that there's some beds that you're adding that you're not going to use for 10 years until population growth is caught up here, excuse me. This comes with the territory. You're not, with public health spending, going to completely rationalize or make most efficient this spending. Another aspect here is it's indirect economic aid. Like, you're spending money on testing kits, and you're spending money on vaccinations, and the producers of those things do not produce those things by and large here in the counties. You're sending money that's set aside for this county outside of the county ultimately. So those are disadvantages, but obviously we feel like the advantages more than outweigh the disadvantages. That's why this is tranche one. Testing and sequencing, vaccination campaigns, medical infrastructure. COVID monitoring is very crucial, not necessarily as opposed to earlier in the pandemic from the standpoint of public health officials knowing exactly what's going on. I mean, that's important, but we have a pretty good handle on that at this point in the pandemic. But from the standpoint of you're operating, let's just say, a food manufacturing facility, and you want to staff up, you want to get people to work, you want to expand this part of the local economy. Well, if there is, currently the United States is fortunate, the rates are ebbing, but especially if rates are not ebbing, as they were during the need of this project, it's harder and harder to do that. It's harder and harder to do the labor attraction that we were just saying we need to do when you don't know how much infection you're bringing onto the job site. So antigen testing, so we're talking about the form of antigen testing that gives 30-minute results, allows for you to scale up production in these kind of at-risk job sites, and allows for the county to do some of this work that's already been doing even more safely to mitigate transmission and increase or restore confidence for some workers who are maybe not yet participating. So the cost for this, and this is very good news, is not so much a barrier anymore. So we're talking about the retail price. We're not even talking about wholesale. The retail price for some of these tests is about $12. $1 million buys a lot of those tests. It can go a long way. Unfortunately, we are in a supply crunch, not just for chips, but for antigen testing. And there's a supply crunch here. So that's why we also recommend that you look after provisioning. You look after acquiring the sort of expertise, the sort of consulting services, really, to make sure that you can get the tests as those supplies are released into the system. Related to this is sequencing. So when you're early in a knock-on variant, like the Delta variant, it's very important to know what you're up against. It's very important to know what the characteristics of that variant are in terms of transmissibility and how active it is at any given time. Now, knock on wood, maybe we won't have another Delta. But in that event, you want to be able to have the variant sequencing available. Okay. Secondly, and this is very, very important, vaccination supports. So we are at the point, I mean, early on in the pandemic, if you really wanted a vaccine, you would have trampled someone maybe in order to get a vaccine. And the big barrier was the supply of vaccines. Now the barrier from the standpoint of public health, from the standpoint of getting vaccinations up and bending the curve that way, is demand. There are folks, and I'm not making any comments about folks who are hesitant or skeptical about the vaccine, who don't want the vaccine. Okay, so we believe the vaccine is going to help public health. So how do you incentivize people to take the vaccine? How do you incentivize these rates to go up? Well, it's very interesting when you study the public policy around this, because early on in the pandemic, some folks had these great ideas that you could do lotteries around the vaccines, and maybe you win a car, maybe you win a vacation. If you're entered into a draw to win a vacation, and maybe this is going to take people who are a little hesitant about the vaccine and get them vaccinated. Well, they did a study, this was a peer-reviewed study in Ohio, the Vaccimillions program. It worked. It didn't work by that much. There was an increased uptake of 0.71 percentage points. And that whole program cost $6 to $8 per person. What's very interesting is that recently, published in the journal Nature, was the results of a Swedish study where they just paid people. They paid people, less than $50 in order to get vaccinated, and that worked. So it's not huge amounts of money, but paying people to get vaccinated does seem to work. And by the way, vaccines, it does seem like their efficacy starts to wane within the first year. So the vaccine literacy, the vaccine inducement that you do initially to get someone vaccinated the first time, you probably are going to have to repeat. There's a huge cohort of people who got the vaccine the first time, and for whatever reason, they don't want to get it the second time. So these sorts of initiatives are things that we think should really be considered, especially by a county like San Joaquin that's relatively worse off in terms of mortality. And then we get into medical infrastructure. You can use ARPA funds to make capital investments in hospitals and clinics. You do run into just basic room problems, where on one hand, maybe there's no place to put additional ICU units, or on the other hand, if you want to do that, you have to take capacity from elsewhere in the medical system. These are not easy choices to make. And then, again, a lot of it's a human capital issue, where maybe you are able to free up some space for ICUs, but you can't staff those beds, and they're practically useless if that's the case. So generally speaking, you can do this. Of course, the beauty of the capital investment side is you aren't taking on as many long-term commitments. On the staffing side, it's a little bit harder. There's also equipment, ventilators, beds, PPEs. We are not experts in the actual demands right now in the hospital system in this county, but we recommend that you consult as you continue to do with those experts, and make sure that they continue to have the tools they need as conditions on the ground change. Now we get into individual and business aids. Individual and business aid. You want to provide support for communities that have directly suffered during the pandemic, and then the corollary of that is you want to provide support for folks that are not otherwise supported. Now remember the slide that I presented earlier in this presentation, talking about direct transfers from the government. On average, the unemployment system has worked at getting people supported who are unemployed, long-term unemployed, because they can't work in a restaurant or can't work on a cruise. So you have to go into any individual and business aid exercise keeping this in mind. Before we get there, we can talk about advantages. If you care about equity, if you want to increase the equality of outcomes in San Joaquin County, this does double as equity policy. It's up to you to decide if that's what you want to do. It's mostly compliant. If you're doing individual and business aid and you can credibly say that the aid is targeted at folks who were disadvantaged by the pandemic, it seems like you're more than free to do that. And of course, with our database that we've provided, we have tried to help you do that. It is direct economic aid, so as opposed to taking money, spending on medical supplies, which are produced elsewhere, not in San Joaquin County, you're giving it directly to local businesses and workers, and so there's more of those multiplier effects. There's some problems though. One, when you're doing any kind of targeting exercise, you don't have perfect information about the people who are potentially getting money from individual and business aid. All you can do is use the category of people or businesses that they belong to as a sort of imperfect filter to decide who does and does not qualify for aid. So that's a problem. There's also perceptions of inequality and favoritism, where there's this idea, I think that's very prominent around any kind of government support or subsidy, that only insiders, only people who know how the government works, maybe people who have been in the country for longer, or speak the language better, or have more basic levels of education, get access to money. So you're not able to target it at the folks who really need it. And anytime you enter into a picking aid exercise, you potentially run into this problem. And then there's a trade-off between your ability as a county to get money to people who need it and the costs that you are going to encounter as you're doing this. The transactions costs for you folks as a county to disperse aid can, with some kinds of aid that require a lot of monitoring, be prohibitive. So you want to avoid that in any kind of exercise that you are pursuing. So, launching off from the previous slide, what you want to try to do with any scheme that you start is minimize information inequality. It's way better to, as a county, give refunds to folks that you can objectively determine have suffered through the pandemic. Utility refunds, mortgage refunds, rental assistance programs. It's much better to do this. It's much better for the county itself to take that initiative than to do an application process, because an application process is naturally going to benefit people who are more insiders, closer to the seat of power, and that's, of course, not what you want to do. Technical assistance is something that when you look at what other counties are doing, it's very popular. So, you set up a small business office or a small business program that says, here's how you start your own e-retail operation. Well, this is all well good in theory, and maybe in San Joaquin County you have this kind of expertise where you can unveil this, but more often than not, when you look at other jurisdictions, this is something that sounds really good, but ultimately you have government officials saying, here's how you start a small business. It's not really working to the comparative advantage of the staff in the county. So you have to really be sensitive to that. And yeah, you really want to minimize monitoring resources as much as possible. So given all these things, what sort of policies are we fans of? Well, we like internet refunds. Okay, we know that as a result of this pandemic, everyone was demanding more internet service. So maybe you had a slower internet speed and you upgraded to a higher speed. Maybe you're using more internet. Maybe you're using the internet all the time in 2019, but then you're using it in 2020 and it's a little bit slower because the infrastructure is the same, but the demand's higher. You can make people whole a little bit here. You can recognize this and you can provide refunds to communities that really need them for internet service. Business license refunds. We like refunds, basically. We like being able to refund money that has already been spent to the exact folks who we determine on average need it. So in order to produce this list that I've kept talking about, and this is a list to be sure of specific businesses that we feel, based on our model, are more eligible or have been more disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. We've worked with county staff using the list that you have in order to do this work. And then we presented it to Jay, and Jay said, this looks good, this doesn't look good. We went back and we optimized a little bit more. What principles? I mean, so I could have gone up here and shown you a bunch of equations about how we conducted this model, but it's better to just talk about the principles. Again, it's better for the county to initiate the aid. So this isn't talking about who to target, but it's like anytime the government is writing a letter to a business saying, oh, you might be eligible for this this tranche of money, here's how you apply for it, that's better than just making sweepstakes. You want to target firms that were uniquely disadvantaged by the pandemic. This was actually a charge that started out this project. This was our first conversation with the county, where there's all kinds of industries that by virtue of just normal creative destruction in the economy are doing less well. And you don't want to use this in a environment like this, subsidize those industries so that they just hang on for just a little bit longer, and then in 10 years, they're in the same position. You want to really target industries that were at least like hanging on or even competitive prior to the pandemic. And when we talk about economic development, I mean, by and large, we've not said that San Joaquin County should use this to do any direct economic development. But when you think about economic development, better to take an industry that was doing pretty well and then suffered significantly and help that industry out, because that's going to factor into long-term job formation, wage formation in the county. You also want to keep in mind, membership for, and we're talking about businesses specifically here, of communities that are traditionally disadvantaged. So you do this for two reasons. You do this because this has been explicitly envisioned by the act itself. So there's language about minority-owned businesses or businesses from what have been deemed difficult development areas. And so what we've done in coming up with this list is set aside businesses that qualify based on these conditions. Final thing, you don't want to subsidize sectors with external resources. The absolute worst thing that you can do with this money is take it and give it to Burger King, because Burger King belongs to the restaurant industry, and the restaurant industry has been suffering during the pandemic. Okay, so we tried not to do that. Ultimately, we got to not do that. As we proceed to the next level of the triage system, let's talk about rewarding frontline workers. The logic here is pretty basic. Hazard pay for essential workers who have sacrificed. Okay, when you're talking about December of 2020, you're talking about a generational level of sacrifice required by folks working in hospitals, or for that matter, working in logistics operations, working in agricultural operations, these very sectors of the economy that we have designated as essential services, and exposing themselves more to the pandemic. Remember, that's why the pandemic vulnerability was so much higher in San Joaquin in March of 2020. So this is a moral case, and it's up to you to, if this is how you want to spend the money, but we said this makes a lot of sense. The disadvantage is it's not tied directly to economic need. In fact, a lot of the essential sectors are the very sectors that have the lowest unemployment hit from the pandemic. Like one goes with the other. It can be expensive. 1 month of hazard pay for grocery workers, we estimated in San Joaquin County would be $3.6 million. That's a lot. That costs a lot more bang for the buck than buying tests. And it rewards survivors more than necessarily victims. I mean, incidentally, this is a problem you run into with businesses too. You really want to set up business aid, so you're not just giving money to the restaurant, the local restaurant that survived the pandemic, that now has a much bigger market because other restaurants didn't survive the pandemic. You want to keep track of the survivor bias. So strategies, hazard pay for essential county workers. There are county workers who have been on the front lines of providing essential services, relatively more exposed to the virus, and obviously the county is the best position to support these folks, but also medical, warehouse, grocery workers, And then pay for workers who've actually contracted COVID-19 on the job. These are the sorts of things that we envision. And just to put a really fine point on this, this comes from another peer-reviewed study. This is looking at the sectors that have the highest excess mortality during the pandemic. You see non-essential, so most of these are essential sectors. Non-essential, this is bottom, second from the right, is relatively close to the norm. Unemployed, also relatively close to the norm. But then, facilities and food and agriculture workers and manufacturing workers even relatively high. Transportation, logistics. Some of the very sectors that have, in employment terms, done well have been more exposed. So there is a kind of moral case, we believe, to addressing some of the, to making them whole. There are specific guidelines about how to structure hazard pay. You want, obviously, to target hazard pay at those doing essential work, which is defined as work not provided from residents and involves regular interaction and regular physical handling of items. And then there's certain conditions about how much you can spend. So, it's not a complete Brewster's Millions when it comes to hazard pay. You can't just say, oh, thank you for your service, you're now a millionaire. But there are reasonable things you can do as hazard pay bonuses. Okay, finally, and most quickly, thankfully, you guys have been very patient, investing in infrastructure. So, the obvious advantage here is there are multiplier activities associated with infrastructure investment. In fact, this is exactly why the biggest proponents of the infrastructure bill that's been slowly lurching through Congress have been so interested in it. It's because there's traditionally a lot of multiplier activity for infrastructure. And it might be high impact, it might not, depends on the sort of infrastructure. The disadvantages, as I've already said, is that it's not a free-for-all with infrastructure money with this bill. There's only certain investments that are allowed. Another disadvantage that's not directly related to the pandemic. This is, quite frankly, something that's been added on to some of the more directly relevant strategies that are envisioned by the ARPA legislation. And it also might be redundant with other government aid. This gets into fungibility again. This gets into what might be untapped with the infrastructure bill. So certain strategies that might be envisioned: park and plaza upgrades, just generally. This is understood by the legislation to be related to health, to be related to being outside and lowering the spread of the disease. Broadband infrastructure upgrades is totally kosher according to the legislation, and water and sewer upgrades that are compliant with existing federal programs, the DWSRF program, the CWSRF program. When we talk about broadband, and remember that case study research we did, a lot of counties are investing in broadband. It's less of an issue up here. Broadband needs are well above, this isn't just our kind of subjective standard here. They're well above the federal minimum standard. They're well above the standard that a lot of the counties that are investing in broadband are aiming at. So what we do recommend is, can I go one slide back, sorry. We do recommend, if you have sewer and water projects that were already kind of envisioned before the pandemic, might as well spend money on those. As I said, it's harder to politically get support to do that kind of work in normal circumstances, and it's very important work. So finally, and this is a kind of recap, you gotta mind the pandemic. It's not over. It's not over in the ICUs in this county, and I'm not saying that money is going to solve the problem, that money itself, ARPA money or any other money, is going to send mortality rates down. But if there are certain needs that need to be addressed, you address them with this money. There's going to be money available for infrastructure, economic development, you name it, coming down the pipe. This is the best chance and the most opportune chance from a public health standpoint to address some of these needs. Target the other aid towards prosperity and resiliency. like, this sounds glib, but actually building back better, actually building an economy that's going to serve as the economic development engine. And I think logistics and food manufacturing are the areas that you should focus on. And finally, and this is somewhat self-congratulatory, but it's mostly congratulatory, you need to have Boy Scout confidence. Always be prepared. You guys have been prepared. You guys have measured twice. You guys have engaged with us. We've done an independent analysis, and it has lined up largely with what you folks are doing. And I think you can stand tall, not just because the county and its economy has done so well during this pandemic, but because the leadership is obviously ahead of other counties that are only now saying, well, how do we comply with ARPA? So with that, I'll open up for questions, and thanks again for your patience.
Thank you. Starting off to my right, Supervisor Miller, any questions?
No, I really don't have any questions. Thank you for this presentation. I had read the report in advance. This is different than what I was expecting. It's broader. I was thinking you were really just going to get a small snippet of assistance to businesses, and this is actually much more thorough. I'm pleased that the scope was expanded so that looking at these kind of investments, it's not as narrow. I mean, it really is focused on what's going to reap the greatest benefits for our residents. So I appreciate this, and I'll look forward to the rest of the discussion and how our CAO lays out what sort of a timeline we're going to work through. But thank you. I appreciate your report very much.
Thank you, Supervisor.
Vice Chair Wynn.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate your presentation, Patrick. A couple of things. One of the things that we experienced in the beginning of this pandemic was there were all kinds of edicts that came out at the federal and even the state level. Unfortunately, in the healthcare community, that almost devastated our hospitals because they had to shut down their operations in preparing for this wave that we were going to experience. And so my concern is that based upon what happened back then and some of the decisions, I think, and not being critical, I think everybody was kind of finding their way. The fact is, if you look back, we made some really bad decisions in the beginning, which really caused some devastation, especially in loss of jobs, tens of thousands of businesses going out, et cetera. So I think that's a concern. And I guess the other thing when we talk about, for example, ICU beds or the beds, if you were to look at our statistics in our county alone, we frequently go to 150% of ICU capacity. We're still treating patients, which means that we're finding ways to accommodate the increase. The other part, and I mentioned previously in regards to staffing, is that I believe, and I saw it throughout the past 19 months, there have been a lot of examples of set up hospital or bed facilities temporarily, for example, in New York City, et cetera, where they come in. I know obviously part of it is the staffing, but more importantly, it is the facility itself, which you can put up and take down. And it would seem to me, if we're really serious about preparing for the future, we would develop a store of these type of facilities that we can put up, hopefully never, but if it's needed, we can put them up. And you talk about PPE, you talk about ventilators, you talk about a whole host of things. It would seem that we want to stockpile those in the event that we encounter maybe another wave of this pandemic. So I think obviously I would see a lot of that money going to set that up. I talked previously about staffing and creating those individuals who can run it. And when you talk about testing, for example, I had a parent contact me the other day. Her son, who was in the first grade, had gotten the flu, which a lot of his classmates had. But to get him back at school, she had to get him tested. and the cost was between about $150 and $250, plus trying to find a place where he could be tested. My point is that I think one of the things we can do, especially because of the roles that we're all faced with, is to provide a subsidy or a payment or an accommodation for parents who are in this situation, because frankly, although that parent can afford it, a lot of parents can't afford that kind of money. So I think we need to look at that in regards to making sure that students get back to school as quickly as possible. It actually goes 24 hours again. In regards to the, for example, we have an organization, Children's Alliance, which is a lot of children's programs, and they have done a phenomenal job in regards to treating children at risk and a variety of things, and I think we certainly could use that, because I know they've been pretty much, because you talk about social services, out of business, and obviously these children who desperately need this care have not been treated. So I would say we would look at that in regards to bringing that program in. At the same time, if you look at the numbers of 50 to 70 million individuals through the pandemic that have created mental health disorders, anxiety, those types of things, I think we can obviously contribute to our behavioral health programs to assist them in maintaining and getting it back to where they were hopefully before this all started. So I think that's a priority. When you talk about business aid, I'll be honest with you, I've had a concern in regards to, for example, essential businesses. Because frankly, essential businesses like Target and Costco and Walmart and a bunch of others, Home Depot, probably have a greater tendency to maybe spread the virus than little, mom and pop stores, so to speak, who may have anywhere 25 to 50 customers as opposed to hundreds, if not thousands. And I only bring that up because I think sometimes we lose sight that, when we address business aid or whatever, that we have to provide a level playing field. And I guess my concern in all these programs is having government pick winners and losers, that because of whatever category you're in, somehow you benefit and others that may have a similar challenge are dismissed because of whatever. So I would be very concerned in regards to that, to make sure that everybody, if we're going to benefit, that everybody who's in that total category, not just segments of it, is to benefit. And the last thing, when you talk about change, especially within a county, where there's 2 locations or a Burger King or whatever, and I'm sure you know that a lot of our franchises, whether it be Carl's Jr., et cetera, a lot of them are privately owned by individuals who may own 1 or 2 or 3, and they're not corporate. That's what I'm saying. But they are, they hire local employees, they are local businesses, et cetera. So I would be concerned about dismissing them just because they have a brand. And then I would offer, for example, a business called Center Appliance, which is in Manteca, Tracy, 2 stores, but they would be considered a chain because they have more than 1 location, if they're totally locally owned. Again, I just think we need to move slowly to make sure that we don't overlook or dismiss somebody unintentionally who should equally benefit from whatever we decide. So anyway, I appreciate that, and I do kind of like the suggestion about business licenses, because everybody pays a business license. And we have a tendency to say, well, if you are hurt more as opposed to this business, then we're going to help you. Well, frankly, sometimes it boils down to the fact that one business is better managed than another. It isn't a matter of unequal opportunity. And going back to what's been said earlier in regards to the healthcare, in the Central Valley, starting in San Joaquin County, we are, first of all, receiving a lot of the pollution that comes from the Bay Area that goes down the valley. We have a much higher rate of obesity, diabetes, lung function conditions, et cetera. And the reason I bring that up is because when you talk about us being so high in regards to the number of mortalities or cases, as part of it is because we've inherited a much more disastrous, I'll put it that way, environment. So again, I think, to be honest, for our staff, certainly our healthcare community, we're talking about private and public, I think we've done an outstanding job in trying to do everything we can. And we talk about Ohio, and we talk about, these other things as far as incentives. The question arises is, if we start putting that, and now we're talking about maybe an annual shot, but I would venture to say, and I won't get into the politics of it, but I would venture to say if we did away with vaccine mandates, I think you would beat that 0.7 increase, because a lot of people are resistant for whatever reason, based upon the fact that they don't want to succumb to what they believe is some government mandate or might be required. So again, I appreciate your comments, and I look forward to having further discussions on this.
I just learned a lot from your remarks, Supervisor. All I would say on the mandates, the point you've made is, basically we believe in incentives, like we're economists. We believe in people deciding that something is going to make them better off and doing it. And if you're a government, that's what you should be, those are the levers you should try to be pulling. So our recommendation is very consistent with that. For the most part, it's like you're the expert about the county, and I'm just learning so much about what you're saying. I think to the business targeting point, what I would say is that from the beginning of this engagement, we were asked to rationalize business targeting. So if you're going to target businesses, how do you do it? But I really take your remarks that an approach that doesn't target at all might make a lot of sense, especially in a county like San Joaquin. An approach that says, we're not going to be able to pick winners, so let's make things as fair as possible. That might make sense. I think if you're going to target, what I would say at the very least is you should not confuse this model we put together that's based on state-of-the-art econometrics with something that's going to get things right every time. So you should build some redundancy into the system so that if some business has been passed over according to a certain targeting exercise, they might have an opportunity to apply or whatever. So you should be a little bit humble when you're setting up any kind of targeting. That's really all I think that demands any kind of response from me, and I thank you for your work.
Let me say,
Yeah.
Patty, I'm not trying to disagree with you.
Yeah.
We're having a discussion as this board will have in the future. And all I'm saying, and I would obviously defer to my fellow supervisors, I think one of the things that unfortunately we've lost to some degree, maybe nationally, is the ability to talk, to communicate, to share ideas. And as I learned from obviously you and Chris, hopefully you can learn a bit from us. So again, I'm not trying to disagree with you, I'm just pointing out some observations from my vantage point. So anyway.
No, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. I really appreciate learning. I mean, everything about, just very quickly about the hospitals, it's like, I think this has been an enduring lesson about public policy from this pandemic. You can have a shelter-in-place rule, but even if you eliminate the shelter-in-place rule, people might not still return to work, or they might still not return to school. And similarly, you can say, a hospital ward is under stress, but if you're not anticipating how people have the knack for being flexible, for improvising, then you're really missing out. So I really do appreciate that comment.
Thank you.
Supervisor Rickman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for being here today. I think we all appreciate it, and we all learned something today. And Supervisor Nguyen, I agree with him, what he just said. I won't repeat a lot of that. I think probably 99.9% of things. And you mentioned COVID, and if you ever watch our board meetings, go watch them. So I'm not going to get too much into that, which I would love to. But we have our meeting on the 2nd, and we can discuss it then. But I do agree when you're talking about paying people. I think, now when you have these mandates and the pressure, I think, you start mandating and pushing people, they just dig their heels in even more. People weren't going to get the vaccine. Sure the heck they're going to get it when you tell them to. And even like the efficacy that you mentioned, like 1 year, and there's just been studies that came talking about paying people. You know, I think in Israel, they were talking about 4 months, 6 months, 8 months, that nobody knows, if we have to pay no government has the money to do that, at least a county government or local government, to incentivize that. So if you have an efficacy rate that keeps, you know, falling, when do you start paying people now to get the boosters? If you did it, you know, on the initial. So, and then the whole issue of natural immunity. And, you know, you're talking about the economy, you know, you're from LA, and how many businesses are losing customers because they're turning away folks that there have been dozens of studies that said natural immunity is robust, good, or even better than the vaccinations. So that's some, you know, things I wanted to hit on. But, you know, when I asked to bring this forward, you know, several months ago, one of the reasons was that, you know, we have received numerous, you know, WARN Act, or Worker Adjustment and Retaining Notification Act notifications. Businesses are reorganizing or going out of business, properties that have been foreclosed on or will be foreclosed on, and many other impacts to our economy as a result of the pandemic. So getting these funds, I know this is broad. I mean, I would have liked it a little narrower in the fact that, you know, what I was looking at, or let me ask you this. Did you guys reach out to, you know, like the San Joaquin Partnership or local Chamber of Commerce and stuff like that, or downtown associations? I think we have a gentleman here from the Downtown Association. And talk to those folks at all? When we're coming up with this?
Our main goal here was what makes sense kind of scientifically, as we say it, what makes sense economically to set up this region for success. So unfortunately, it's a, you know, limited engagement. That requires looking at the data and looking at what generally other folks are doing with this money and assessing the options and coming up with a strategy. It just wasn't how we understood the engagement, a part of it to do that kind of consultation.
All right, interesting. You know, when we talk about business aid, and
Supervisor,
yes.
if I could jump in, we did, and Patrick might be able to elaborate on this a little bit, work with our Employment Development Department, and I forget who we got the WARN notice information from, I believe it was the clerk of the board, and we made a cut to go through that. And one of the things that we were finding, and Patrick mentioned it in his presentation earlier, with the WARN Act notices is the ambiguity of the data, because just because somebody got a WARN notice and their business might be impacted, either they were curtailing certain operations or going out of business, it was difficult for us to determine whether that was a business that was already failing and was just pushed over the brink by the pandemic or not. And as they tried to model that out, it became very difficult to do that, and we didn't want to start mistargeting businesses because of that. It got cumbersome, and so we wound up having to put it aside. But that was one of our very primary things that we attempted to do. We did work with our EDD folks for long-term unemployment individuals, and quite honestly, that was enormously cumbersome. One of my staff had worked considerably on that. Was it through directly you, Sandy, or?
No, it was through employment.
And again, there were just logistical challenges with the massive amount of data and manipulating that data to be able to get at something that was meaningful and useful. And to address Supervisor Wynn's comment, we got the database that they gave us is about 14,000 businesses. And it's imperfect, as Patrick said. I mean, you're working with kind of under a bell curve here. We're not planning on, we do plan on finding a useful purpose for that information, but I wouldn't perceive just sending checks out to folks that weren't on there. What I could see doing is merging that, because we, as Patrick mentioned in the beginning of this thing, and then again when he concluded, we've done about 65 or 70% of what they recommended already. We didn't wait for the report because we knew the report was going to come for a while, and we had our money first. We were probably one of the first counties to get it back in May. So as this information started to flow in and we started to get drafts and all that, we started adjusting and aiming what we were doing in conjunction with what they were recommending. And so what we plan, as we merge what we've done already, and we take this detailed information that we have for these targeted entities to see who may have been missed out on what we've done already, and then maybe just send shoulder tap notices out to them that, hey, you may be eligible. We still have criteria that they would have to meet before we would send them any money. We would look at them before we would send them any money. But just as a kind of flag wave to these folks that you may be eligible for funding if you are interested. So I did want to.
Ms. Wilson, on that, I mean, you know, I'm glad you guys did a great job, our staff did a great job. And I mean, again, this was in March, and it's, you know, almost November now. So of course we didn't wait until November to start doing the hay. So one thing I was going to mention, you know, we did get ahead and, you know, offer grants and accountability for, you know, different types of business. So no, that was excellent. You know, I just wanted to make sure, and when you look at, you know, the larger the scope at which this is, it is good in the fact that, look at the type of industry. I just want to make sure that the money that we get, or we're spending it where it has the most impact, right? And, you know, for example, you know, our small businesses, you know, you talk about unemployment and so on, like Thornburg was talking about, but what about, you know, when the government mandated businesses to shut down or limit their customers, whatever it may have been, whether, you know, it changed from week to week, you know, depending on the mood of our governor. But, you know, how much savings did, you know, that small mom and pop business deplete? How much in debt did they incur just to stay afloat? You know, things like that. I mean, for me personally, I think that would be a good use of, you know, trying to find that. And I think we did a lot of that with that grant. But, you know, you talk about what industries were hit the hardest. And I know I was the chair of the mega region group, and one of the studies, I believe it was from, and please don't quote me on this because I don't have the paperwork in front of me, I believe it was the University of the Pacific. And one of the major industries that were hit, and I didn't really see it on this list, is hotels. You know, that kind of, because they were shut down. They were one of the hardest hit here in the state, and correct me if I'm wrong on that. Is there something that we can specifically, you know, target with them and help them out if that's something available?
Supervisor, may I just throw something out there quick? You know, it's one of the things that I've learned in my years doing this is you always have to have the humility of just going into a region and not understanding what's happening on a street-to-street basis. What we do is we come in, we're data scientists, we try to give a best scientific answer about how you parameterize or how to think about a lot of these broader questions. And what you're talking about in terms of bringing folks to the table to have that local view is incredibly important. One way to think about it is, let's say you come up with an economic development plan. There's three ways you can do an economic development plan. One is you just ask local folks what they think should be done, which is good because they're going to have the ground level idea, but they don't have a broad idea about how these things work and what's going to be the biggest impact. You can come in and get some, you know, highfalutin, you know, consulting company out of San Francisco, and they can walk in and tell you all the things you need to do without ever talking to anybody at the ground level, and that's going to end up being a paperwork. The right way to do it is and I think what Patrick was trying to accomplish here, is you give some broad parameters as to what kind of programs you need to put in place, and here are the things you want to think about, or things you want to worry about, or things that are really good outcomes. But then at that point in time, the job's not done. And then you got to go to the ground level. Then you have to talk to these folks in the bids and these various regions to really make this work at the local level. In other words, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the job is not done. We've given you some broad parameters, some ideas, but to the point, I mean, Jay and his team are going to have to go out there and work with these local guys to make this stuff actually work, because you're absolutely right. It's only at the ground level can you really make these things happen. And you know, look, Patrick and I, we're not from here. We can't possibly have the information, but we can at least give you the guidelines that'll help that local operation work that much more effectively.
But we do have housing here if you want to move here. So, just real quick, Chair, and no, I appreciate that, you know, the broad aspect, and, you know, I agree with you, and I think it makes sense. Our work is never done, you know, we're always, you know, striving to be better and take care of our constituents. You know, and something that Supervisor Wynn mentioned that, you know, the board, I know I've been talking about it a lot too, and you talked about the infrastructure. And you talked about, just go back to COVID in the last 18 months, 2 years now, you know, behavioral health, mental health, you know, look how many suicides went up, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, domestic violence, you know, all these different things, you know, there has to, you know, be somebody there to, you know, help some of these individuals through. And, you know, I think we have done that in the last 10 months, and we expanded and got more mental health professionals and stuff like that hired on to the county. So I think that's a start, but of course, there's more to go, even like a long-term substance abuse program that we really don't have here in San Joaquin County. And lastly, I was so glad when we were talking about infrastructure to see Ms. Cunningham sit back there, because he mentioned parks, right? And that's coming to the board, and again, I think, you know, I think it's an insight joke. I've been giving her a bad time about somewhere in South County Park, but again, thank you very much for a very thorough report. You know, we appreciate you being here, and I think people that are watching online will be very informed and appreciative and see what the steps that we are taking and making sure that we make people whole, at least as best as we can, help out. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Supervisor.
Quick question. First CAO, what's the dollar amount that we're looking at? I know there's up to X amount of dollars. What have we already utilized? What have we received, and what are we expected to receive?
Thank you, Chair. Our first tranche of ARPA money that we got in May is just over $74 million. So we've made commitments to date. We've made $59.4 million in an array of commitments. I can go over them if you'd like.
No, so it's 11 million left over there.
There's 14.5. Oh, hang on.
Sorry.
Sandra Regala's coming. She's going
If I
to
could
give you.
just.
I thought I had the latest.
Yeah, then you do. It's just if you look below, because one more, your board just approved the ISD project,
I
so
was
6.5.
going to get to that.
Okay.
That's okay. No, I'm glad you have my back.
Okay, so we received 70 million, and we spent down, I think we were just at, you spent down 59, so that leaves 11.
Well, you're a little over 70 million, you said. Yeah, 74 minus the 59, we have 14.5.
Okay.
We got a little bit of interest in there. And then we have ISD projects that just went to the board for 6.5, and we have just over $8 million remaining that's uncommitted.
And then we have another 70 million, 74 million coming?
In May.
Okay, in May of months from now.
22.
All right, so then this presentation was informative, different phases, of course. And then is there a plan B coming forward for use of our funds, or is that something you're generating? Is that something we're supposed to generate? And the reason why I asked that is I'm a little disappointed. I would have liked to have seen some numbers. Because if we're getting dollars, what's going to stimulate, I mean, honestly, internet upgrades was something I really can't see us getting behind. So I'm really struggling with that one as floated out as a use of funds. I would have really loved to hear something about creating an enterprise zone if in any capacity we have underserved, parts of our communities that have had dramatic impact from people losing jobs and industries or businesses closing down in certain sectors of our community that are struggling, and this may or may not fit in, but I sure would like to see that plan B, where we're going to utilize some dollars and make it where those dollars are going to be beneficial for our local economy and the families of the people that are trying to take care of and raise their children, much more so than internet upgrade. And I'm just picking on that one little thing. And you did float out some great ideas, but how are we going to actualize it? What dollars? What were we looking at the best use of funds? So I'm thinking that's plan B.
So, Chair, I'm sorry to hear you were disappointed in what you heard today. But what I'll go through is some of the things that we did do, and we have no intent, we haven't spent any money on internet upgrade, nor do we plan to. And if you recall from the slide, we were a deep blue, which means we're at the top of the food chain. So doing that there would be no economic benefit for us to do that. And there are a couple of things that because they didn't recommend it because they thought we should do it. What they did is they recommended it based on a hierarchy of what was available for us to do based on, as you heard Dr. Thornberger say, they didn't do it in a closet by themselves, nor did they get it from the street up. It was a combination of the two. But let me just briefly go through what we did do and how they fit into some of the things they put out there. And what we're planning to use is, well, first of all, the report was a great validator. And like I said, I didn't wait until we got the report to maneuver what we were doing, and we didn't want to wait and just say, oh, well, we have 74 million, and now we got the report, so let's kick it into gear. We wanted to, as the pandemic was going into
we've been very proactive, and I appreciate that. You know, we have definitely been proactive. It's just what are we doing next?
Can I just clarify one thing on the internet upgrades? So the recommendation isn't that the internet infrastructure here is lacking and we need to upgrade it. The recommendation is that there are people who have been disaffected by the pandemic, and a very easy administrative way of making these people whole is to refund their internet. So this is a way of doing individual assistance. It's not a way of doing infrastructure assistance. So I just want to make that very clear. So the point at the end actually...
It lands with about the same thud for me. Just for me personally, I'm one of 5 supervisors. It's just my interpretation, that's all.
And then just one thing on enterprise zones, if you'll allow me. Enterprise zones is actually an area where we have a bit of expertise. Like I said, we're economic development folks. Any sort of scientific peer review study of enterprise zones, by my reading of this literature, has concluded that they do not create new jobs. When we talk about insider advantages, when we talk about some of the most problematic aspects of economic development and how it tends to be practiced in communities, in my personal opinion, or rather, in my informed opinion as an expert in this field, this is far from a policy panacea, and in fact, it might not be the best use of funds. And on top of that, the Treasury Department has said, be very careful about how you do economic development with this money. And it's a red flag. I mean, there are ways to do enterprise zones, but it is a red flag for those folks at Treasury to go down that path. So we should consider it.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. I know there's a tight line to walk, but you know, for instance, there's things that we'll all talk about because there's, I think, a plan B that has to come forward. You know, I took down notes. I'm thinking vocational training, because we all talked about jobs and the shortfall that we have of trained. We know that if somebody lives somewhere and gets job training, 70% of the time they stay there versus going away, getting education, and then having a job opportunity while they're somewhere else. So, you know, these are possibilities that we'll talk about in phase 2. I'm guessing at some point. You know, there's opportunities out there, floated out there, expanding, looking at parks and recreation, using things that are within the parameters. We know we have first 5. We just given first 5 additional dollars when they came asking at the board. There's more dollars to go for youth and development and for child services. First 5 is exactly where it needs to go. It's a great structured plan and program. They're very effective. They're boots on the ground, and they're highly integrated into the community. And that's an organic program right here in the county. So, you know, again, I know there's going to be a plan B to this. The discussion. I'd like a little more meat on the bones. And to Supervisor Rickman's point, I think some of the business community would have liked to have been engaged in some capacity. We have a very robust level of volunteers, people that are just inside the business community. There's chambers of commerce that would have liked to maybe sit down, talk, being given ideas of what is or isn't going to be possible, and let them weigh in on what the needs were in their community countywide. So it's something that we'll probably have to do, and again, that might be a plan, part of Plan B. I'm going to double check real quick if Supervisor Villaputo has any questions or comments, and I'm not negating the work that was put in and the information that was given, very good information. I'm just looking for more. I'm a business guy. I like to find out what we need to do and do it as quickly as possible because people are struggling out there.
And I appreciate that. One thing I do want to point out about the enterprise zones, aside from some of the cautions that Patrick had mentioned is when you look at where we've already funded, the chunk of the money that we've sent out already for small business grants, family grants, homeless, RAD card program, which we funded twice, and other things that are associated, which are captured in the presentation. They're all been cost reimbursements or direct expenditures. If we provide, and we can do it, but if we were to provide a $5 million block of money to some entity and said, here, spend this wisely for whatever it may be, we now become a subrecipient, and everything is subject to subrecipient monitoring. We now have certain reporting that has to be done. Audit things trigger in a single audit, both on our side as well as the recipient, and there's a whole cascading administrative set of things. I think Patrick mentioned you have to be careful of the administrative thing you may get tangled in, and we've consciously avoided that up to this point because of that.
Understood.
So just one.
And one last thing before Supervisor Villaputo, you may have a question, but I was going to say, as we talked about, the frontline workers and people that have had extra stress and getting them some dollars. If we had 2,500 of them getting a couple $1,000, that's $5 million. What percentage of the dollars we have are we considering? Again, that might be part of Plan B of how we'd use dollars. One of the biggest impacts I've heard from is many people with the in-home support services. These people have gone through extreme hardships helping out those that are homebound and serving them, and they still get their minimum wage. They're definitely on the front line of helping those that are very much in need. I will turn, Supervisor Villaputo, did you have any questions or comments? And I'm going to open up to public comment at this time. No. Supervisor Villaputo, if you're with us, let us know.
So Supervisor Villaputo let me know that you did not have any questions. He was concerned about his battery level. He was going to let me know if he needed to sign off. If he's no longer on the Teams meeting, then I'm going to know that he's out from the meeting from this point forward.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any public comments that have been sent in? No. Okay, so then members from the public, I'm uncertain where you're, maybe come up to the podium. So please come on up, identify yourself, and we're here for your comments.
Good afternoon. My name is Kevin Doherty. Hello, supervisors. Appreciate the opportunity to speak, and I understand that I've got limited time, and I don't want to lose any of the other speakers that are going to be coming behind me, so I just want to start off by saying that we provided a PowerPoint presentation that was sent earlier, and that PowerPoint was a draft. So I believe that you have that. I also brought in the final, and so we've got hard copies of that. And so that PowerPoint is a 30,000-foot level, if you will, view of my brief comments. My comments are, since I've got limited time, I apologize in advance. I will be reading most of them just as my guardrail so I don't veer off. I appreciate Beacon Economics comments. They're great. I'd like to read their report more and have more discussion about what they indicated and what they presented. So I've got the PowerPoint here. Actually, since my comments aren't consistent with the PowerPoint because I didn't have the ability to look at it in advance, I won't be going through the PowerPoint. But you have copies, and maybe we can do that afterwards. So the one thing I wanted to indicate about Beacon's comments, the PowerPoint is referred to as a road to recovery, and after listening to Beacon Economics comments, maybe it should be ask the county to make an investment in the community. And that's basically what we're here for today, is to tell you about property business improvement districts and community benefit districts and how they are in need of county-wide support for their formation and their renewal. I'm a commercial property owner in Stockton's Miracle Mile district. This is a mid-town Stockton location on Pacific Avenue between Harding and Alpine. We formed our PBID, Property-Based Improvement District, almost 15 years ago under California's Streets and Highway Code Law 1994. The district's formation requires a petition and balloting process of the potentially assessed property owners. Essentially, we are self-assessing ourselves as property owners to deliver a high level of community benefiting services to the district and increasing the quality of life while lessening the burden on government.
30 seconds.
Pardon me?
30 seconds remaining.
Okay. The County of San Joaquin should give serious consideration to a grant application matched by a city that will provide a funding source for the creation of new property assessment districts in these areas negatively impacted by COVID. These districts are critical and are self-empowering tools to allow stakeholders to generate revenue to fund improvements to their respective districts. PBIDs and CBIDs are a perfect strategy for economic recovery countywide. This is a one-time funding ask only for formation and renewal. It enables an equitable division of skin in the game, 1/3 by the county, 1/3 by the city, and 1/3 by the district. The ongoing operation of the district is paid by the ballot-approved self-assessment.
Yeah, but you have another minute. We're going with the PowerPoint, and if you have something more to finish, please.
I appreciate that.
Thanks for being here for the last few hours to get to this point.
Thank you very much. District formation is expensive. It takes time. It can run $70,000 to $90,000 and take anywhere from 9 to 15 months. It's a democratic ballot process to form the district and requires a lot of effort by the property owners and the merchants. The various cities in the county need financial support in their business districts and downtowns to mitigate the impact of forced government shutdowns due to the executive orders by the governor and county government. We are months in the planning process for the MMID 2023 renewal. Again, we've been around for 15 years. We've renewed 2 times. This is going to be our 3rd renewal. We renew every 5 years. We're in the process of developing a strategy that will allow us to renew for longer than 5 years. The problem is it's democratic and it's balloting, and not all property owners want to extend for 10 years. Based on the law today that we are under, if we renew for 5 years, then we're there for 5 years. You can't disestablish. And so we don't ask for 10 years, we ask for 5 years, so we get the support to renew. But it's expensive. Again, every 5 years, it costs us between $70,000 to $90,000. So we've got more. This is at the 10,000 foot level. We've got more information that we can provide. We appreciate the opportunity to present. And I've got 3 of the presenters, so I'm going to step aside.
Thank you, Mr. Doherty. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Chairman Petty, would you like to keep the 3-minute timer?
Yes, that's fine.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having us. Appreciate it. I'm Dino Margaros, and I'm the Executive Director for Downtown Tracy, also known as Tracy City Center Association. I know Supervisor Miller and Supervisor Rickman are both pretty familiar with districts like ours. Specifically, we're a PBID, Property-Based Improvement District. I'm just going to talk a little bit. I think you went through the technical aspects of what a PBID is and that kind of thing, but I'm going to go into a little bit more why we care. Why do we care about downtowns? Why do we care about these districts? Typically they're downtown, but not always. Miracle Mile is an example of a district that's not necessarily downtown, but they serve the same function. I think, and I don't want to put words in Supervisor Rickman, but I think in the 10 years we've existed, our PBIDs existed since 2010. So we're in our 11th year right now. We're up for renewal in 2025. It's a very expensive process, but I think it's worth it. I'm not just saying that because we're part of it, but I think we've been able to affect change like no other time in the past 25 or 30 years, going back for our specific downtown. Downtowns have gone through a transition, like the mall came, hit us hard. We had to transition into something else. Now the roles kind of have reversed. Now the malls are getting hit hard, big box is getting hit hard. So we're still trying to do our thing. They're gonna have to transition into something else. It's just a very difficult process as, the economies come up and go, what's old is new again, and it just keeps going in cycles. So we do things like business attraction, business retention, security maintenance. A big part of what we do is events. The most visible part is what we do, but we're not just party planners. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes for economic development purposes. We've got our economic development analyst from City of Tracy here with us. She's got some stats on perhaps if you want to hear taxable sales and stuff like that. But prior to COVID, we're on an upward trajectory. I think taxable sales are up 150% in the 10 years that we've been doing it. Rents are up. Probably about 75% from where they were when we started. So we've been able to affect that change, and I think we've proven that we can do it. The problem where we're at right now, and the reason we're here asking for some help with funding for our renewals is that it's a very expensive process. It's upwards of $40,000, $50,000, $1,000 just to do a renewal. All of us are kind of in the same boat. I know City of Manteca's here. They don't have a district. They'd like to start a district.
30 seconds.
District formation is pretty expensive as well. With COVID, we got shut down. Bottom line, we got shut down with events, and that's about 66% of our income. We, of course, have assessments on the properties and the buildings and the linear frontage, but that doesn't pay the bills, to be honest. So we're on life support right now. We need to get our district renewed. They need to get their districts renewed or established, so that's why we're asking for some sort of funding to help us out with this. So I appreciate that, and my comments there. And appreciate you guys, your comments and everything were good. I like your ties to UCR. I went to UCR, graduated in 91, so I built that.
Thank you.
Good. Well, I guess it's evening now. Chairman, members of the board, thank you. My name is Tony Lundgren, and I am the Deputy City Manager with the City of Manteca. Thank you to Beacon Economics, and I'd also like to extend thank you to the county administrator who also invited all of our cities out here today. So thank you for this opportunity. One thing I kind of want to touch on too is we in Manteca, we don't have a PBID yet formed or a community benefit district. We're starting to get some new businesses right now downtown, and we've been really trying to assist them in any way that we can. It's definitely something of interest of us. So I would say if some of the efforts go towards downtown revitalization or helping out economically, our businesses have definitely taken a hit downtown, and we are trying to support them the best that we can. But if in your funding allocations, if you're developing any program specifically for downtown, we're definitely interested. So thank you all for your time, and have a great day.
Thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you.
Any other public comments? And Madam Clerk, anybody send anything in? Okay. And
Can I just make?
before you, I just want to come right back and let you know that I thank you. And when I say my frustration or my lack of, that's just my opinion. The rest of the board, we're all highly engaged. Your information is exceptionally informative, very beneficial for us. I'm looking for what's plan B, let's go, what's next? And that's coming. We know in May that those dollars are coming. So between now and then we could formulate, we're listening to some individuals representing different districts in cities throughout the county. So I don't want you to think that in any way, shape, or form that I don't appreciate, respect, and value what you brought forward. I'm always wanting more. What's next? What can we do? Don't take it the wrong way. I really, truly appreciate it.
I don't think we did. I just want to say something quick, which is, I love bids.
Yeah.
These guys are great. I mean, you look at places I've seen like downtown LA, and that place has been transformed by the bids.
Yeah.
So, remember what I said. I mean, actually, when you think about the world we're in right now, job attraction is less important, worker attraction is more important. That's where the shift is going. And it's exactly the bids that can get neighborhoods up and running to become part of that worker attraction process. So I couldn't agree more.
Having them here, they're speaking on behalf of some of the private sector, that's great. I know that, as supervisors, and I know Supervisor Miller will add something in a moment, but, we listen, we're engaged, we're absorbing, and we're going to look, each of us will take away things that, speak up. I know that Supervisor Rickman is looking for a park in South County, And Ms. Cunningham, our director, that's been on her table for a while. So we want to see how we might be able to utilize this. And as Supervisor and Vice Chair Wynn pointed out, what type of infrastructure, what type of preparedness can we advance our hospital? So we're each taking away things from this, and there's much to digest. I single out the internet lands as a thud for me, but that's not personal. That's just
Democracy action.
yeah, I'm looking for like, what's the real big meat and potatoes that's going to make us a profound difference. So I'll bring it back to the board for closing comments for the special meeting, and thanks, of course, CAO Liberty for making it happen. Supervisor Miller.
Thank you. First, I want to thank the folks from our BIDs and CBDs that were here today. I met with them and encouraged them to come and to bring their information both in writing and also to make their presentation during public comment, and gave them the criteria that this board has been operating under the principle of not ongoing funding. It's a one-time ask for one-time money, that their city and their business owners needed to have skin in the game. And so I'm really pleased to see how they came and they listened and they structured this, that it would be a partnership. And I personally believe it would be a very powerful way to help jumpstart some of our most local businesses. So I'm hoping that our CAO, as we move forward and we see the next iteration of this and some dollars attached to it, I'm hoping that our CAO can meet with some of the representatives and maybe flesh this out and see if this is something that makes sense for us to invest in. I would also like to say that I do support fully funding the testing, especially the rapid testing and vaccinations, and if that requires incentives to get more folks. Nobody likes the mandates. Let's see if we can't provide some incentives. I would like to see our CAO work with Greg Diedrich, Dr. Park, and Joan Singson to see what their needs are on the ground. If it's another van for the mobile testing and vaccinations, whatever it is, they're already on the ground, so they know what the ag community is still looking to receive, what our manufacturing community needs. Let's get that fully funded and make, from my standpoint, a priority. I also strongly believe that childcare is going to be critical for any economic development to get folks back to work, and I agree with our chair. We have a lot of expertise built into our HSA department and First Five specifically. We have a lot of partners like Family Resource and Referral that are very experienced, and we should be able to figure this out. We heard from our district attorney the other day that it's a priority for all of her staff as well to make sure that their children are in a safe, not only a safe, but in an educational environment. So I think we need to focus on that. I agree with Supervisor Wynn, our behavioral health services. We already know that our residents have suffered across the line, but especially our students, all of our students, all the way up to seniors in high school. So I would like to take the input from the Children's Alliance, and I think we're going to be hearing from them in the future. Our County Office of Ed, our Behavioral Health Services Director, we have a tremendous team of people that deliver these kind of services countywide, and I think we should lean on them and see what are the highest needs and get the dollar, get the price tags for them. And I agree, hazard pay for the folks that have been on the front line, that's a great concept. I'm still very unclear how we would make that work and how we can make that affordable. So, I mean, we could easily use every penny of these dollars just for that. And so I'm not sure how that's gonna work, but we have a lot of folks, not just the folks first responders, folks in the hospitals, but we have the folks at all the long-term care facilities. We have all of our behavioral health workers. We have all of those folks that have been, you know, continuing to provide essential services. I'm just not sure how to do it in a way that we can afford, but it's still meaningful to them. If you give everybody $50, that's not really much of a thank you for putting your life on the line. So I think that needs to be, we need to take a careful look at that. But I really appreciate this today. I realize it was high level, and I'm looking forward to kind of drilling down now with our staff and having things come back with the price tags on them, so that the board can really kind of take a look at how do we prioritize based on the investments that would be required. So thank you to everybody that participated in this, all of our staff that contributed as well, and especially to you, Mr. Wilberding, for taking the lead on this, listening to what we had to say way back in March and April, and really positioning us out in front of the curve. I mean, that's what we heard loud and clear today, that we have been making some smart choices, and I'm pleased to see that we're going to continue that. So thank you.
Vice Chair Wynn, closing thoughts or comments?
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank Chris and Patrick for your presentations. It's a lot to digest. And I also want to thank Jay and your staff. I know you've done a lot of work, as you stated. I think one of the things that I take away from this is there's a lot of opportunities that are available, and look forward to a discussion with certainly Jay and your staff and others too, since you're probably more grounded than we are, even with this great presentation. We're finding out exactly what we can do. And I would agree, you know, as Supervisor Miller talks about, there's a lot of great potential projects. It's just a matter we have to toss them out to see what we can afford, and probably, again, provide the maximum effectiveness in use of these funds to prepare for what I think primarily this focus is on the next pandemic as a result of the disastrous results of the last one. So again, thank you all for your participation. Thank you, Chair.
Absolutely. And Supervisor Rickman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for being here. Thank you, Jay, for bringing this forward. And you know, when I brought this up and requested this to be brought forward, you know, I know we talked multiple times and when it was coming back, and you know, I'm glad to see the macro look at it, and I think that's what our chair was saying. You know, going looking at the micro, meeting with some of our community leaders and business leaders is our next step. And you know, before we spend any money or anything like that, it's coming back to the board, correct? Because I mean, for incentives and stuff like that, you know, unless you can, you know, prove that it works. And you mentioned earlier some study at Ohio, whatever, and I remember reading a newspaper article here in California that said, you know, California spent this extraordinary amount of money and it didn't work. So instead of dumping money into something, you know, make sure that's coming back to the board for approval. And downtown, I talked to some downtown folks, not, you know, by chance, old Johnny O about this. And you guys, I spend a lot of time downtown, and you know, if the county, they're going to start putting money into downtowns and cities, which I wholeheartedly agree with, and I believe this is what you guys were talking about. The city's going to match or bring in funds too, correct?
We have to talk about it, but I think what Supervisor Miller's like, skin in the game, I think,
Right.
you know, I think we all have, but it's a pretty big tab, and, you know, we have our
I'm sorry, Chairman Petty, if we could have him come up to the microphone, and I'd like to be captured on the recording.
I think, we haven't talked about it, you know, for as far as who's gonna do what, but I think a matching funds collaboration is something that does make sense. Whether it's a renewal or whether it's a new district, the fees are pretty much the same. It's about a $50,000 expense, and like I said, the reason with COVID, you know, you lose 60% of your income for a year and a half, and it puts you behind the 8 ball quite a bit, and I just don't want to see the districts go away, and I truly, Matika's left, but they really need, something to jumpstart their downtown, and they're very effective, and, I agree with you guys. We have skin in the game. Our property owners are paying into the assessment. They're assessed on their property taxes. So we do have that. We do have other funding, but grant funding in this case is going to help save us a little bit and probably help Antigua get there. And there's other cities. There's Ripon. There's a lot of others, even Lodi.
No, absolutely. And I know we good to tie this up here. But no, I support that and what I was referring to. And like I said, I love downtown. I'm in downtown. A couple times a week, more probably than I should be. But, I know the city of Tracy, they receive ARPA funds too, and
Yep. And they've allocated big skin in the game as far as parklets.
Exactly.
$500,000 of that ARPA funding is going towards parklets for extending out outdoor dining for downtown as well. So I think there's a way, that, and again, I don't want to speak for Barb, she's a city representative, but I think there's a way that we can come up with a matching type.
no, I don't think it's going to be a problem. I just wanted to make sure that, cities are, we're partnering together.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of our biggest strengths as far as Tracy goes, is that we have a very good, outstanding relationship with our city staff, with our city council, with our merchants and our property owners, and that doesn't always happen. We go to a lot of conferences where they have breakout sessions on how to develop a good relationship with your chamber, with your city council, with your city staff, because sometimes there's an internal tug of war, and we're not in that situation.
Downtown, and we'll leave it there, downtown Tracy, is excellent, and, the community always comes out and supports it. We have a beer fest, or a beer, what is it, beer stroll?
Taps on 10,
Taps on
craft
10,
beer tasting,
So,
not this Saturday, but the following Saturday.
you can roll skates, you want to come down? No?
We had our candy crawl last week, so the kids were last week and the adults.
No, yeah, you guys are doing a heck of a job. Keep up the good work. You in Downtown Association, let us know, like you did today, what we can do to help. Or, I don't see anybody on this board saying, no,
we
we can't
appreciate it,
support
yeah.
anybody.
We didn't expect any kickback,
No.
but, it's just like one of those other opportunities where we can get.
Right, I know I gotta get running here. I gotta go watch a football game at Tracy. So.
Then stop talking.
Thank you very much.
And we're gonna wrap this up real
Oh,
quick.
and real
Jay.
quick too, just let me know when his internet goes out.
So maybe in conclusion, Jay, what might be great is go one-on-one with each of the supervisors and different takeaways, different levels of support that would go for the next phase of how we're going to use, so we are prepared and we've kind of put earmarked what dollars might go. And then as a board, we'll come back and talk collectively, okay?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that, Chair Patty, and I also took some notes, reaching out to some of the community organizations, getting the ground level. We're not, how do I want to say this? Our backs were a little bit to the wall before because we had the money dropped at us. We were heading into this third wave, and we actually, I think, did a really good job. And if you recall, everything we did, we took before the board. You all approved it. We didn't spend a nickel without you all going, yep, that's where we want to put the money.
Right.
So, and it will be nice to be able to put it together more in a, what do I want to say, blueprint fashion, and say, this is what we're looking at to do with the next tranche. This is going to go a ways in helping us do that. So.
And Supervisor Miller has something. Supervisor Rickman, don't go anywhere. Supervisor Miller.
Just real quick, I was under the impression that, sort of timeline-wise, we were going to do our board overarching strategic planning to update our principles and overarching goals, and then we would be fine-tuning this almost immediately. We would move into that phase because we want to make sure that whatever comes to us for the ARPA funds is consistent with the updated
Board priorities.
board priorities.
Which we're scheduling for the end of January.
Perfect.
Okay, sounds good. I think we're good. We're going to adjourn this meeting, and we will be reconvening on Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021 at 9 a.m. Thank you.
Thank you.